Orders of the day, order du jour.
Business of supply, opposition motion. Motion sur l'enquête publique.
Motion on the public inquiry into the Mulroney-Schreiber affair.
Monsieur Thibault.
Mr. Thibault, West Nova, seconded by Mr. Cosner, moves that in the opinion of the House, the government should end its delays and immediately commence the public inquiry into the Mulroney-Schreiber affair. Debate. The Honourable Member for West Nova. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today. Could I have a glass of water, please? It's my pleasure to rise on a matter of great importance in the conscience of Canadians for a very long time, for about 20 years. It's an issue that has not yet been resolved, an issue that has the potential or even the probability that influence was exercised over a government, that actions were taken against the interests of Canadians, that groups of individuals and corporations earned abnormal profits because of these actions. When Mr. Mulroney's government was toppled, these actions continued. Money continued to change hands.
You look at the whole, what's come to be known as the Airbus affair, but is much wider. It includes MBB, it includes Thiessen, and may include other deals. It includes commissions that were paid secretly in the area of $25 million through a company called International Aircraft Leasing, and some money given back, most of it in Canada, a lot of it, through very few individuals closely associated with the Prime Minister of the day, Brian Mulroney, and later we see where some money was given directly to Mr. Mulroney himself in cash. And it's a matter that remains unresolved. So the motion is quite simple. It is that in the opinion of the House, the government should end its delay and immediately commence the public inquiry into the Mulroney-Schreiber affair. The Prime Minister has been forced or shamed into saying that there would be such an inquiry, but has been doing every attempt to limit the scope of the inquiry. He has suggested that the inquiry couldn't begin until the work of the committee has been done. Well, Mr. Speaker, the committee has heard its final witnesses, and at one point shall put forward a factual report. But we know that the Commission cannot have access to any of the work of the committee, none of the testimony of the committee, and not of the report. It must do its own work. The work of the committee is privileged and cannot be used in any other tribunal or forum. At its base, this is a story of greed, it's a story of betrayal, it's a story of intrigue, I believe of bribery, of double-crossing, and of influence peddling. And when you look at how it worked and the people that were involved in this, it is quite complex, and it has many facets. What you have is you have a group of individuals who see a void in the leadership of the country. They see that the Liberal Party had been in power in a long time and that the public of Canada are ready for a change. And they see that within the Conservative Party there's a void in leadership. Joe Clark is at the lead, he's had a minority government, it doesn't survive. So they arrange, including some offshore money, who were trying to get Conservative governments elected worldwide, they arranged to overturn the leadership of Joe Clark. And they find what they believe to be a bright, young, perfectly bilingual gentleman with business experience, with charisma, certain panache, and they see him as the vehicle to getting power in Canada. Somebody who can align all the right of the country, all the right political side, and bring some people from the center. And they're successful. They overturn Joe Clark leadership. They get Brian Mulroney elected as leader of the Conservative Party. And they immediately decide on how they're going to set things up. What will be the structure? How do you do business with the Government of Canada in the upcoming Mulroney era? And they see a gentleman very close to Mulroney, part of that group, Mr. Frank Morse, former Premier of Newfoundland. He's got a company called Autonova that does lobbying in Ottawa. He's going to bring in new partners. He creates a company called GCI, Government Consulting Incorporated. And he brings Mr. Gary Willett aboard as a partner, another part of the Mulroney organization. He also brings a Mr. Jerry Doucette. Mr. Jerry Doucette is a former Minister of Education from Nova Scotia, not always a supporter, I believe, but not necessarily part of the inner workings of the Mulroney organization. But his brother is. His brother Fred Doucette is. And his brother goes as Chief of Staff in opposition for Brian Mulroney. And it's my belief that Jerry Doucette is his proxy at GCI. Then Mulroney forms the government. And business, it's well known at that time, Fred Doucette is working in the Prime Minister's office. Now, he may tell you that he was attached to external affairs. Some people may use that argument. But I think if you talk to anybody who was around government in the days from 88 to 1993, they will, from 84 to 1993, they will tell you that if you spoke to Fred Doucette, you spoke to Brian Mulroney, that he was the Brian Mulroney operative. He was the person who was the closest to Brian Mulroney. How he was organizing the operational chart wouldn't matter too much. It was well known. This was PMO, and this was the higher reaches of PMO. So they have it organized like that, and then that's how you're going to do business. If you want to do business in Canada with government on major contracts, that's the corporation you go with. So one of the guys who was involved from the very beginning, brought in because he could bring in German money into the leadership, was Karl-Heinz Schreiber. Karl-Heinz had been in the country for quite some time, even had Canadian citizenship, was well established in the Bavarian region in Germany, was known to Franz Josef Strauss, who was chairman of Bavaria, or president of Bavaria, or prime minister, whatever the proper term is, well connected with Thyssen Industries, well connected with Airbus and MBB, well connected with all the industrial companies of that area. And Airbus was a company that was in great difficulty. A lot of money and political capital had been expended by the governments of France and Germany and other European nations in creating this company. So you had to get some major sales in quickly, and the opening had to be the North American market. So Mr. Wolf was another operative, Mr. Schreiber. Their job becomes to get Airbus into Canada. And they have the political contacts now. They've built that. So they negotiate a deal and an arrangement as to how they will be getting paid. From Airbus, they will be getting $20 million. And they decide how to work it. I remember a quote by Mr. Schreiber suggesting that Strauss had said that you're either a complete idiot or a genius. Because what he devises is we go through a smaller company. We get Airbus on the ground and flying, and they're going to be so efficient, so much better on fuel and operating cost, that once we get some on the ground in North America, all other airlines will have to buy it. So they do. They go see Ward there. They go see Mr. Ward. And they do a deal with him. And according to Schreiber, and only public inquiry can get us to the bottom of this, and I don't believe take all of what has been told by any of the witnesses as the committee as necessary, full, and ultimate fact. But what he tells us is that the same group that I mentioned earlier around GCI and a couple of other operatives who will later become on the board of Air Canada, that they go and they meet with Mr. Ward and they say, we're going to give you a great, great financing deal. Airbus is going to give you a great, great financing deal if you buy Airbus. Plus, you'll get domestic landing rights for scheduled service in Canada. You'll create a national airline. And we see later that Ward Air became quite valuable commodity and was sold to Canadian Airlines, I believe, at a good profit. So the first aircraft comes. So then there's no longer, now there is the seeds to bring Airbus in Canada. You have them flying internationally. So not very long after that, you'll see other companies start buying it. One of them, the big one, is Air Canada, because they can get 30 of them. And based on the value of the airline, of the aircraft, and its thing, probably that Air Canada would buy it, but you don't take that chance. So you change the board, including putting Mr. Frank Moores on that board. Now, Mr. Moores will have argued that he had nothing to do with Airbus. And Mr. Greg Alford of GCI told us that GCI itself had nothing to do with Airbus. But that's contradicted by evidence, where we have a letter dated February 3rd of 1988, signed by Mr. Frank Moores, under GCI letterhead, and it's signed as the chairman. Oh, well, I'm not sure he signs as the chairman. Yes, he does. Sorry, chairman of GCI, writing to Mr. Franz Josef Strauss, dealing with Airbus and the impediments for getting Airbus to Air Canada. So we have that contradiction already. So eventually, the Airbuses get sold. $20 million are generated and starting to work. So then there's another deal on the go. Same group, same people. It's called Thyssen. Create a company called Bearhead International. And the deal here is that you go to Cape Breton, an area of high unemployment. You get the alliance of somebody like Elmer McKay, who was regional minister for Nova Scotia at the time, close friend of Brian Mulroney's. You get his support, and then you drive to get a factory building armored personal carriers in Nova Scotia for the Canadian military, US military, and export generally. The idea was that you would be able, Germany would then be able to export into countries that the German constitution and law doesn't permit, but you could do it through Canada or other countries manufactured in Canada to an open market. 20 million were generated by Airbus on sales of $2 billion. Here we've got potential sales of $7 billion. This is what we're looking at. Imagine the commissions that you're talking about. So it's a great deal. So there's a project. And it requires some assistance, requires some work. Part of that is it needs an agreement with the government of Nova Scotia. Part of it needs an agreement with the government of Canada. Government of Nova Scotia signed. $2 billion in commissions are generated. And there's some problems with the government of Canada. And eventually gets signed. It gets signed in November of 1988, or in October, when Mr. Perrin Beatty, then a minister of the Crown, is told by Mr. Fred Doucette that he must sign. Now, there's no evidence, and I don't make the suggestion that Mr. Beatty did anything untoward. He's told the Prime Minister wants this deal to go through, so the deal is signed. Letter of intent with the Thyssen International, or Thyssen, with the Government of Canada for the Bearhead project. This is in the fall of 2008, in 1988, in October. That generates $2 million in success fees and secret commissions that are paid. That goes to the International Aircraft Leasing account, controlled by Karl-Heinz Schreiber. He'll tell you that it wasn't his company, but we know he has control of it. Then it goes to another account called Mercure. Then some of it goes to an account in November of '88 called Bitucan. Bitucan is a company registered in Calgary, held by Karl-Heinz Schreiber. Now, when you look at how that money is distributed, you quickly find that a check is generated for $90,000 to Fred Doucette Consulting International. Now, this is interesting. Fred Doucette sends an invoice to Bitucan for $90,000 on the 2nd of November, 1988. Now, these are days after the agreement is signed. Fred Doucette tells us that he left PMO late in September of '88. So in a matter of a few weeks, Fred Doucette Consulting Incorporation would have generated what he terms as professional services for $90,000. $90,000. What that? Well, maybe he's incredibly good. Maybe it could be. But what's interesting to me is that the same invoice, same amount, on November the 8th, is sent to Bitucan on behalf of Frank Moores. Frank and Beth Moores invoice for $90,000 for the same thing, services rendered by Frank Moores on your behalf, $90,000. This, again, is coming out of the success fee. So Frank Morse has been working on this for years, not 4 or 5 weeks like Fred Doucette. He gets $90,000. Same day, same time, Lemoine Consulting Incorporation. This would be Jerry Willett, again, a partner in GCI. Professional services rendered, $90,000. Same time, check goes out the same day, November 15th. So he's been working on it for years. Not him, but his company has. But all of a sudden, there's this success fee for professional service. Gerald Doucette and Associates, other partner. Fred Doucette wasn't a partner, but he got money under his company. Fred Doucette, Jerry Doucette, his brother, gets a check, $90,000. Now, he hasn't left PMO at the end of September. He's been working on that for years. $250,000 for Bitucan Holdings Limited. Now, what's also interesting, Mr. Speaker, and I know I'll have the support of the opposition of the governing party to table these documents later, is that we have a handwritten banknote from the banker in Zurich indicating that the Canadian $500,000 is put aside in an account called Frankfurt. Now, the interesting thing when you look at Frankfurt, Mr. Speaker, is that the Frankfurt account becomes the account where the money comes out for Brian Mulrooney in 1993 and 1994. That becomes the account where that money comes from. Now, you could argue that it's coincidence, but is it coincidence that that amount is a quarter of the success fee? Exactly a quarter. Is it coincidence that earlier, dealing with another project, that Pelosi will have testified at the committee that they will set up an account in the name of Brian Mulrooney, called Devon, to receive monies in Germany on behalf of Brian Mulrooney from their success fee. That, sir, is coincidence.
A lot of coincidence.
Then you have, later on, we find out, and we fast forward a while, and we get to the time when the government is going to change. And all of a sudden, and if you look at the testimony in the Airbus settlement, Brian Mulrooney will tell you that prior to the Airbus settlement in 1993, in 94, he had a couple of cups of coffees in passing with Karl-Heinz Schreiber. He doesn't really know the guy, no close association. But in 1993, Brian Mulrooney is about to leave office. And he's at the Prime Minister's retreat at Harrington Lake, and all of a sudden a meeting is arranged. Brian Mulrooney is to visit the Prime Minister, Karl-Heinz Schreiber is to visit the Prime Minister. Now, I've had the close association with 2 Prime Ministers. I haven't been invited a couple of days before they leave office to a private family retreat, and I don't think very many people have. But it happens that following, and if those who have would have been close friends. Now, Karl-Heinz Schreiber tells us that that meeting was organized by Fred Doucette. Fred Doucette comes to the committee and he says, I have no recollection of setting up such a meeting. Then we get the proof by Karl-Heinz Schreiber that he had set up that meeting and the Montreal meeting. And then we get a letter from the lawyers of Mr. Doucette saying that Mr. Doucette didn't say he didn't set up the meetings. He said he had no recollection of it. It's a little bit like Oliver North when he was before the Senate Investigating Committee, and I remember his answers. I have no recollection of that, but if I can provide the documents to the contrary, it might refresh my memory. This is the situation that we had with Mr. Doucette. So they meet. And the best we can figure out, they agree that they would do business at the future. No money changes hands, and no amounts are necessarily discussed. We have no evidence to prove that it was. But a short time after that, when Brian Mulrooney is still Member of Parliament, they meet at an airport hotel, and he receives an envelope with $100,000 in cash. 2 subsequent meetings at envelope, he gets $100,000 in cash. Now, this is the words of Karl-Heinz Schreiber that it was $100,000 in cash. Brian Mulrooney tells us that it was only $72,000. It's a little bit like the prostitute. The profession is not at question, only the price. So that money changes hands, and it is in cash. Then we have argument amongst these individuals in the future, and Brian Mulrooney becomes very scared. Very scared that maybe this can be proven. So we have a meeting in Zurich. Again, organized by Fred Doucette. So they meet in Zurich, he tries to convince him. We have a letter organized by Elmer McKay to try to show that there would be no lawsuits. And that is brokered by Elmer McKay to bring to Harper, so that Mulroney can show to Harper that there will be no problem in the future, that we can be safe, that it won't go to court. What makes me extremely nervous is that when you look at what the situation is now, Karl-Heinz Schreiber once told me what they have set up now is exactly the same. You have Mulroney operatives like Marjorie Le Breton, law partner like Mike Fortier, a lackey like Peter McKay, the chief of staff at Transport and Minister of Transport, all with close associations to Brian Mulroney, all with where the money is handled by the Government of Canada. Mr. Speaker, I hope we have the full support of the House and that we will get this public inquiry underway shortly.
Oh, the honourable member for Edmonton-Sherwood Park is rising on a point of order.
I think it's a little too late right now because it already slipped out of his tongue, but you will note that he very, very flippantly used the name of a member in the House, and we both know, and all of us here know, that that's against the rules, Mr. Speaker.
Oh, I missed that. I'm sorry. Of course, the honourable member for West Nova knows that referring to members by name is out of order, and I'm sure he wouldn't want to repeat that mistake. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Peterborough.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there were so many what I would call inaccuracies in the member's statement, or things that he alluded to where there is absolutely no evidence for that whatsoever. Perhaps they come from his many dining experiences with Karl-Heinz Schreiber, in which he also, Mr. Schreiber, of course, can't back any evidence up because he provided us essentially 3 binders full of junk mail. But I do understand that a number of dinners that that the member for West Nova did have with him, dating all the way back until last August, according to Mr. Schreiber, that I guess a number of these conversations took place, and of course the member for West Nova is taking these as fact. But what I take issue with is his point that a report from the standing committee would not be of any value, that it couldn't be considered. In fact, that's not true. The testimony, in fact, can't be used in public inquiry, Mr. Speaker, but the recommendations of the committee are to be considered by Professor Johnson. That was the commitment that was made. So what this member is saying, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely not accurate, and I strongly encourage him to stand in his place and very specifically commit that he will work to put recommendations in place that will form the basis of a public inquiry.
The honourable member for West Nova.
First, Mr. Speaker, let me assure the House that everything that I have stated here today, everything that I have said, has been said at the committee in testimony, and any documents that I refer to have been available to the committee. We have received reams of documentation, most of it without value, but some of it with certain value. I recognize that the only way, and I've said that from the beginning, that you will get to the bottom of this is with the public inquiry, but I would refer you and the member to a letter of October 29, 2007, by Mr. Schreiber to the Prime Minister. Now, you can argue as to the validity or the truth of anybody's correspondence, and I don't make that case, but I bring you to one letter, one paragraph. During the summer of 2006, and this is Schreiber to Mulroney, you again asked for a certain letter from me to be able to support my case, which I have sent to you on July 20, 2006 for your meeting on July 30, 2006. Now, the meeting of July 30, 2006 referred to is a meeting between Brian Mulroney and the current Prime Minister at Harrington Lake. The letter of July 20, 2006 is the letter that was shown at the committee that had been brokered by Elmer McKay, that he had done the first draft on the fax, and then that was modified by Schreiber prior to signing it. And then what he stated again is able to support my case. And those words, I think, are important, because if we only heard it from Mr. Schreiber, then perhaps we'd have to cast them aside. But we also heard it from a close personal friend and a longtime associate of Brian Mulroney, Mr. Elmer McKay, where he said that the reason, in my questioning, the reason for brokering this letter is that without it, Mr. Mulroney could not be helpful to Mr. Schreiber. So there was clearly an intent, at least between those three individuals, that this letter would assist Mr. Mulroney in getting assistance for Mr. Schreiber from Mr. Harper in 2006. Now, the only thing I can imagine that could have been for would have been for the extradition matter, and the only counterpart that I could imagine that Brian Mulroney would have had in that is that the lawsuit against him by Mr. Schreiber would have been dropped, and all the facts based on the $300,000 would have gone the way of the editorial board of the National Post and would have been swept under the rug.
Honorable Deputy.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Bruno-Saint-Lambert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to thank my colleague from West Nova for providing an excellent summary of the events. I think that this will help us with the debate today. And I would like to hear the reaction with respect to Peter Burrow, who seems to be denouncing something that we've been hearing for quite some time. Is it because the Conservative Party had something to do with this? My question pertains to the member for West Nova. I'd like to ask him, the Public Inquiry Commission, what type of mandate should it have, and when should it be set up? Thank you. The Honourable Member for West Nova. I'd like to thank my colleague for the excellent work she has done on the Parliamentary Committee. As far as I'm concerned, the public inquiry should have as broad a mandate as possible. We want to ensure that our commissioner can look at all avenues, because that's the most logical way to go about studying this issue. We know that $225,000 was spent was given by Mr. Schreiber. If we can look at where all this money wound up, perhaps we'll be able to find all the mice involved. Thank you. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Ottawa Centre.
And I appreciate the opposition motion in one sense, that is that people want to get to the bottom of what happened with Mr. Mulroney and others. But we do have a commission that's going to be coming up, and I'm just wanting to ask the member, we just had a budget this week, which it's failed Canadians, failed my constituents. We have the Hogwarts Pork Barrel Express coming from Peterborough. We have no housing. Why do we have to debate this when we have a commission of inquiry about to be set up and we know it's going to happen? Why are the Liberals spending their time on this instead of the budget?
The Honourable Member for West Nova.
I'll use that. Thank you.
I don't know how to answer that, Mr. Speaker. Only a New Democrat would think that when you can subvert the government of Canada into signing deals on aircraft worth $2 billion, where you can work on a project that would hit $7 billion so that a few people get their commissions and that they influence government, that has no importance to the people of Canada and that it shouldn't be raised before this House. After that member's colleague in the House brought that motion to the committee that we study the Karl-Heinz Schreiber matter, I find it ridiculous and irresponsible.
Honourable Member for Moncton Riverview Dieppe.
Mr. Speaker, credibility is always an issue, and there are sins of commission and sins of omission, Mr. Speaker. I want to ask this honourable member, the truth by commission, telling the truth by commission, saying positively what happened, and telling lies by omission, whether he thinks that is present in this case, when the former Prime Minister of this country didn't even tell his own PR people, that it was $300,000, when he lied under oath by omitting to refer to his meetings in detail with Mr. Schreiber, and when he lied under oath at that discovery, whether that sets up the table for this commission of inquiry to look into the credibility of Mr. Mulroney and everything he said, including the reason why he accepted $2.1 million for lawyers' fees and PR fees when he didn't even tell the experts the truth.
Member for West Nova.
It becomes understandable why the Prime Minister would not return to the committee on invitation, because he could not clarify his comments. He could not contradict people who had shown that his comments were not factual. he said under oath, he stated that I believe it was in 1990 that he'd killed the Thiessen project. He told his chief of staff, I believe it was 1990 or 1991, that he'd killed the Thiessen project. But then we see that there are meetings organized that Mulroney is aware of with his top aides and the clerk of the Privy Council dealing with the Thiessen project until 1993. We see that all through his government after that day that there was. He said on the road that he had no dealings with Karl-Heinz Schreiber. We know he'd been working with Karl-Heinz Schreiber throughout, that he'd been meeting with him. He even brought him to Harrington Lake in 1993, just prior to leaving office. He sent him all sorts of correspondence. He accepted money from him in 1993 and 1994. He said at the committee that he was working for Thiessen internationally, selling tanks to China. I'm sure that the Chinese government, that's what they're looking for, encouraging the German military and defense corporations. Exactly what China wants to do. Thiessen themselves told us it wasn't true. All his close associates who testified told us they couldn't confirm that he was doing that they have no knowledge of him doing that. More importantly was Mr. Lavoie, who, on behalf of Brian Mulroney, had called Karl-Heinz Schreiber the biggest and I won't finish the word, liar we have ever met. And then when I asked him if he still believed that, he said, well, he's top 5. And I believe I know who he's referring to in the other ones because he's seen all the mistruths, misstatements of his former boss.
Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'll be sharing my time with the member for Peterborough. I also want to thank you for this opportunity to respond to the motion introduced by the member for West Nova. The motion states simply that, in the opinion of the House, the government should end its delays and immediately commence the public inquiry into the Mulroney-Schreiber affair. Mr. Speaker, I cannot in good conscience support this motion, because to do so would in effect denigrate the efforts of our Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics and the work of Professor Johnston. In fact, this issue came up last night during our committee as well, and after some debate we had a vote on the question. I watched later that evening on the cable public affairs channel as our committee chairman suggested that there was unanimous consent in the committee to recommend an immediate public inquiry. There was not. I believe it's important to correct the public record on this. Members of the government expressed that the public inquiry cannot commence immediately for some simple and logical reasons which I will explain in the coming minutes. There was a vote. My government colleagues and I voted against the motion because of the hasty and intemperate language that would insist on forcing the government to act inappropriately. As my honourable colleagues are well aware, members of the Ethics Committee have been hard at work for several months investigating the various allegations made by the former Prime Minister and Mr. Karl-Heinz Schreiber. To launch a public inquiry before this committee has had the opportunity to complete its work and table its report and recommendations would not only show a great deal of disrespect for all those involved, but handicap the public inquiry before it even started. As you will know, Mr. Speaker, our committee has spent the last 4 months studying 4 aspects of this matter. We looked at the Bearhead proposal, the Airbus libel settlement, the consulting agreement between Brian Mulroney and Karl-Heinz Schreiber, and the handling of correspondence by the Privy Council Office. We heard from Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Schreiber, and we heard from a number of witnesses who had direct knowledge of their business dealings. The government made a commitment to Canadians that we would work to seek out the truth in this matter. We asked every witness who appeared a series of questions. In fact, we asked each witness whether or not they had any knowledge of any wrongdoing by any public official regarding Bearhead, Airbus, the consulting agreement, and the Privy Council Office. Not a single one did. Every witness, including Mr. Mulroney and Mr. Schreiber, confirmed for us that there was no wrongdoing with respect to these issues. Somewhat ironically, after having made certain allegations, the only wrongdoing we became aware of during our proceedings was Mr. Schreiber's own failure to declare the importation of a large amount of currency into Canada and the United States. Nevertheless, Canadians are still left with a bad taste in their mouths because a former public office holder took large cash payments. While there may have been nothing illegal about the transactions, it certainly created the appearance of conduct that falls below the standard we expect of former Prime Ministers, as Mr. Mulroney himself acknowledged in his testimony, and he will have to deal with the shame of this matter for the rest of his life. Surely, Mr. Speaker, after each member of the committee, both government and opposition members, has spent so much time examining this issue, it would be foolish to commence an inquiry before the committee has had the opportunity to give its report. I anticipate that the committee's report will, among other things, identify some specific recommendations regarding the terms of reference for a potential public inquiry. Indeed, I'd like to ask the opposition members who currently support today's motion, what was the point of the hearing's numerous hours of testimony and scouring through thousands of pages of Karl-Heinz Schreiber's submissions and numerous other documents if we're not going to offer the House the benefit of our counsel? Holding hearings for 4 months is not an insignificant expense, yet that seems to be of no concern to the members opposite. The opposition insisted in the fall, and we agreed that a public inquiry was the best way to handle these allegations. Yet, in their haste, the opposition decided to preempt a public inquiry with the committee hearings. We disagreed with that approach, but we respected the will of the majority and participated faithfully in those hearings. And now, in haste once again, the opposition is attempting to have us ignore the work of our committee over the past 4 months and prematurely move to a public inquiry. To insist on one hand that the committee hold these hearings and then not take them to their logical conclusion is irresponsible. Members should recall the Prime Minister has asked Professor Johnston to finalize his recommendations on the terms of reference for the public inquiry once the committee has completed its work. Until we file our report and give the House and the public the benefit of our wisdom and counsel on this matter, our work will not be complete. Members need to be reminded that although holding hearings and gathering evidence is laborious and time-consuming, it is not the full work of our committee. In fact, it is only half of our job. The other half is to synthesize what we have heard and learned and condense that knowledge into useful recommendations and conclusions. Often that process does not take as long as the information gathering phase, but it is no less important. And that, my friends, has not happened. Until it has, the committee has not completed its work. Mr. Speaker, when Karl-Heinz Schreiber made his allegations last fall, Canadians demanded to know what transpired between Brian Mulroney and Mr. Schreiber. And at that time, this government committed to securing the truth and sharing it with Canadians. We took timely and effective action on this matter. The Prime Minister appointed an independent advisor to conduct an impartial review of allegations respecting the financial dealings between Mr. Schreiber and Mr. Mulroney. The mandate assigned to the independent advisor included 4 areas: to conduct a review of the allegations concerning financial dealings between Mr. Schreiber and the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, to make recommendations as to the appropriate mandate for a full and public inquiry into these allegations, including the specific issues that warrant examination, to determine whether any prima facie evidence existed to suggest that criminal acts have taken place, and to indicate whether any additional course of action was appropriate. To fulfill this mandate, the Prime Minister appointed Professor David Johnston, the President of the University of Waterloo. Professor Johnston has impeccable credentials and is widely admired for his considerable legal experience and expertise. During his career, Professor Johnston has served on numerous provincial and federal task forces and committees, so there can be no doubt that he is perfectly suited to conduct a thorough and thoughtful review and provide sage, independent advice to the government on this matter. Nevertheless, soon after Mr. Johnston accepted his mandate, the Ethics Committee initiated its own review of the matter. This move by the opposition preempted proceeding directly to a public inquiry because this government respects the sub judice principle. That means the government will not hold a public inquiry while a parliamentary committee is examining a matter, the same matter. Over the past 4 months, the committee subsequently heard the testimony of the 2 men at the centre of the affair and a number of other witnesses who have knowledge of some elements of this issue. Unfortunately, to their discredit, the opposition overreached its hand and brought witnesses who had no knowledge whatsoever concerning the matters the committee is studying. Regardless, in honour of the commitment made by the Prime Minister to the Prime Minister, the independent advisor released a report in January of this year and the Prime Minister accepted it. To quote from the Prime Minister's statement of January 11th, and I quote, "I have also asked Professor Johnston to finalize his recommendations on the terms of reference for the public inquiry on an expedited basis once the committee has completed its work, and I'm pleased that he has agreed to do so." End quote. In order to effectively complete the study the opposition insisted on last fall, the Standing Committee must have the opportunity to carefully analyze the testimony it has heard and render fair and accurate recommendations. And I am confident that once we have supplied Parliament with our recommendations and the full benefits of our work over the last 4 months, that the independent advisor will provide sound guidance and wise advice regarding a public inquiry into this matter. The honourable member's motion, however, seeks to short-circuit the process. It suggests that the current approach, studied, deliberate, and respectful of the serious issues at stake, should be immediately set aside and replaced by a public inquiry. But that public inquiry would not have the full benefit of the work we are doing and the knowledge we have gained as a result of these hearings. The motion would have us ignore the informed counsel of the committee membership and the recommendations we would make based on the last 4 months of testimony we've heard and the evidence we've examined. I therefore urge this House to reject this rash, impulsive action. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Moncton Riverview Dieppe.
I want to thank the honourable member for his comments. I have a couple short little questions because I found some internal contradictions in what he had to say. Mr. Mulroney told the truth. Mr. Mulroney did no wrong. There were private dealings between private businessmen. We shouldn't delve into it. Yet Mr. Mulroney should bear the shame of what he did. These are the member's words. What shame, I might ask, is he talking about? If it's shameful, it's certainly on this side of the House. That means probably something that isn't good, something that perhaps you can't excuse. So I want to know what he meant by that. Would he like to withdraw that? Would he like to say that outside the House? Because maybe Mr. Mulroney might sue him. Secondly, I'd like to ask him, all through this process, and I was there most of the time, he and his colleagues decried the methods and the being of the committee as being ineffective and tautological and useless. So why is it now that he's holding up the work of the committee and saying it's a wonderful example of how Parliament works? Surely he has enough faith, as was said many times by the ministers here, in Dr. Johnson and his acumen to see what happened before the committee and funnel it in to good recommendations to go forward with an inquiry. Why is he now for holding up the inquiry, which his ministers on the front bench wanted to get to so soon, so often, Mr. Speaker?
Here.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs.
Well, Mr. Chair, I normally have a fair amount of respect for my honourable colleague and the questions that he asked at the committee. But at the present time, I've lost a great deal of that respect because of the fact that he's exaggerating some of the accusations and some of the comments that I've made. I have said repeatedly that the committee has a place, but a limited place, to do this work. And I've also said that it's a logical inconsistency for the opposition to, on one hand, demand that the committee address this matter, and then yet not allow the committee to complete the job that they were demanded to do in the first place. It's irresponsible to suggest that we've taken it this far and that we're not going to complete the job that we began in the first place. So, I mean, the member can't have it both ways. He can't, on one hand, say it's imperative that the committee address this matter, and then on the other hand say everything that the committee did was useless or does not matter or won't bear any reference to what a future inquiry might have to say. So maybe he could explain his inconsistencies on this matter.
The honourable member for Saint-Bruno Saint-Hubert. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm somewhat astonished by what my colleague has said about the new delay in setting up a public commission of inquiry. According to the information that I have, it contradicts, in fact, it directly contradicts what his leader, the Prime Minister, has already said, and I will quote him. In his statement on January 11th, 2008, the Prime Minister said that he would set up the commission of inquiry as soon as the committee hearings were over. He didn't say as soon as the report would be made available. And this is the Prime Minister speaking, and I quote, "After having examined the report and consulted with Mr. Johnston, the government agreed to set up a commission of inquiry as soon as the Standing Committee on Ethics has ended its hearings." And our hearings ended last Tuesday. This is now Friday. So I can't understand why the honourable member is contradicting his leader a month and a half later. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps my honourable colleague did not hear my speech in its entirety, and I'll quote just briefly from it because I think it addresses the question that she had. I, in fact, used the same quote that she just referred to of the Prime Minister, saying that I've also asked Professor Johnston to finalize his recommendations on the terms of reference for the public inquiry on an expedited basis once the committee has completed its work. Well, in order for us to complete our work, I submit we have to submit a report. We've concluded our gathering of information. We're not going to be hearing from any more witnesses, but we have not compiled our data. We have not summarized the testimony. We have not come up with any recommendations. And until we do exactly that, we have not completed our work. So I don't understand the accusation made by the honourable member.
Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Peterborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to oppose the motion that, in the opinion of the House, the government should end its delays and immediately commence the public inquiry into the Mulroney-Schreiber affair. Honourable members, this government opposes this motion for a number of reasons. The House of Commons Ethics Committee has been conducting hearings into the so-called Mulroney-Schreiber affair since last fall. Hearings were held in late November, December, January and February. It has included a review of the former Prime Minister's relationship with Mr. Schreiber and the alleged cash payments. Mr. Schreiber and the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney have both testified before the committee. After 3 months of hearings, the committee is expected to table its report in the House today. On November 14, 2007, before the Ethics Committee stated that it would hold hearings, Prime Minister Harper announced the appointment of David Johnson as an independent advisor. Mr. Johnson was appointed to conduct an independent review of the allegations surrounding the financial dealings between Mr. Schreiber and the former Prime Minister and to make recommendations for an appropriate mandate for a public inquiry. The independent advisor conducted a great deal of original research, analyzed potentially relevant terms of reference for the public inquiry, and published his thoughtful report in January of this year. Mr. Johnson has accepted, at the request of the Prime Minister, to follow through with the recommendations for the inquiry after the Standing Committee finishes its work. The public inquiry has an important aim: to let Canadians hear from their former Prime Minister about his dealings with Mr. Schreiber, to get to the bottom of the matters once and for all, to discover the truth and to ascertain if any wrongdoing did occur and what lessons can be learned. The Right Honourable Brian Mulroney has appeared before the Ethics Committee and made his statement and answered the initial questions of the committee members. It is important that any public inquiry be able to build upon Mr. Mulroney's testimony. The inquiry will not be open-ended or called to review ground that has already been extensively reviewed in other investigations. The purpose of the public inquiry will be to establish facts that remain unexamined. My honourable colleagues, there are clearly unanswered questions in so many in the so-called Mulroney-Schreiber affair. And we on this side of the House want answers to those questions as much as anyone else.
Exactly.
And as I noted before, we need to wait for Mr. Johnson's recommendations for the inquiry. It is well established that a public inquiry is neither a criminal trial nor a civil action to determine liability. It is a process by which facts are found and that the public can be informed and the recommendations for corrective action can be considered and made. And rushing into the process by starting the public inquiry stands to gain nothing, but risks losing any chance at all, of getting to the truth. As courts and commentators have cautioned in the past, Investigations and inquiries must proceed carefully with due process to avoid excessive costs, Mr. Speaker, duplication in effort, delay, and unduly rigid procedures or lack of focus. Before I conclude, I'd like to say, I'd like to digress very quickly, quite frankly, and say this motion brings to mind one of Aesop's fables, the tortoise and the hare. I'm sure it's a story we're all familiar with, Mr. Speaker. The hare was forever boasting about how he could run faster than anyone else and was always teasing the tortoise for its slowness. So one day, the tortoise challenged the hare to a race. The hare was convinced he could win easily. But as we all know, he was beaten by the slow and steady tortoise. The motion in front of the House today reminds me of this fable because I'm wondering what the rush is. Why start a public inquiry now without waiting for Mr. Johnson's independent advice on the terms of this inquiry? Right. This is an old story, Mr. Speaker. It's about setting history straight. It's about getting the facts right. What is the rush? What is the rush now? Honourable members, we should not act in haste. We should proceed slowly and ensure that the so-called Mulroney-Schreiber affair is uncovered and the truth is known once and for all. Exactly. As the tortoise say at the end of Aesop's fable, slowly does it every time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Very well done. The honourable member has done his speech in record time, but since it's almost 11 o'clock, I'm going to postpone the questions or comments that are consequent on that speech until after a question period, if that's all right with the honourable member. And accordingly, we will start with déclaration des députés.
Statements by members.
The honourable member for Vegreville, Wainwright.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I congratulate the member from Edmonton-Sherwood Park for his excellent work on Bill C-484, which is an improved version of a bill that I introduced and debated in this House about a year ago. This bill, if passed, will protect unborn children who are targets of violence when their mother is a victim of a crime. Mary Talbot, the mother of 2005 murder victim Olivia Talbot and grandmother of Olivia's unborn son, said this to Joyce Arthur, who is a detractor of this bill, and I quote, "Please show some respect for my daughter and her unborn baby's memories. And I feel I can ask the same for the rest of the families who are at this time grieving the loss of their loved ones. I hope you never have to experience the pain and anguish and sense of injustice of losing a beloved family member to violence, only to learn that no crime was committed, only to learn that the one your heart breaks for was of no worth." Well said, Mary, and enough reason for all MPs to vote for Ken Epps' bill, Bill C-484.
I think the honourable member meant the honourable member for Edmonton-Sherwood Park, and I've had to rebuke one member apparently for using somebody else's name this morning already. I hate to think that this is going to be a constant repeat. L'honorable député.
Member for Ottawa-Vanier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I'd like to pay tribute to a great man, Dr. André Gauthier. The Ontario section of the Family Physicians College of Canada gave him a certificate of recognition to underscore his exceptional contribution to the care of his patient. This well-deserved tribute was given to him during Recognition Day for employees of Montfort Hospital last December. People in the Ottawa community who know this doctor call him our Dr. Welby, referring to the old TV series about the life of a family doctor. Be it the care he gives his patients, the compassion he exercises in his profession, his humility, his dedication to his community and to Montfort Hospital, or by his home visits, house calls, the doctor is the ideal portrait of someone who takes the Hippocratic Oath. Thank you, André, and thanks to your family for sharing you with our community. The Honourable Member for Apantiki. The Minister of Finance is managing to displease all of Quebec. Everyone's unanimous. The government of Quebec, the opposition parties, the financial sector, the economic sector, manufacturing sector, everyone agrees this budget is not for Quebec. It is empty and void. It forgets the most hard-hit sectors of the economy. None of the Conservative MPs from Quebec, be they ministers, secretaries of states, or ministers, or members have been able to raise awareness of the needs of Quebecers with the finance minister. They say they're in the House to have things move, but where are these ministers and secretaries of states to respond to the needs of Quebecers? Luckily, Quebecers will not be duped. They understand their inertia, and they know the Bloc is the only party in Quebec that can defend their interests and values. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Ottawa Centre.
Mr. Speaker, last Tuesday the government announced that while a city like Ottawa, which is in need of funds for a transit system, the government will instead invest in the Pork Barrel Express. Mr. Speaker, the Pork Barrel Express will go from Toronto through Conservative ridings like Whitby, Oshawa, Durham, Halliburton, Lakes Brock to Peterborough. Mr. Speaker, no one knows the cost of the Pork Barrel Express, estimated number of passengers on it, or who will operate it. It will be costly with comparatively small number of passengers, and it is not on Ontario's list of priority public transit projects. Mr. Speaker, you won't find the NDP supporting this kind of cynical, runaway political train wreck of physical policy backed by the Liberals. We will put our stock in the needs of hardworking, everyday Canadians who want more investment in all cities, childcare, nurses and doctors. And you know what? Who will need them because, Mr. Speaker, while the Conservatives put pork first, we in the NDP put everyday people first.
The honourable member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia.
Mr. Speaker, please join me in congratulating two Canadian heroes that are a living embodiment of what our Canadian forces stand for. On April 26, 2005, during a blizzard in the Northwest Territories, search and rescue technicians Master Corporal Brian DeCare and Sergeant Darcy St. Laurent parachuted from a 17-wing-based Hercules aircraft to assist a downed aviator near Boland Lake. In complete darkness, they performed a challenging night drop. The rescuers and the downed pilot were forced for 5 days to wait out terrible weather conditions. As I speak, the Governor General is bestowing medals of bravery on both these men. The motto of search and rescue techs is, "These things I shall do, that others may live." These two men exemplify the selfless duty that our men and women in uniform perform every day. Let me say on behalf of all Canadians, a humble thank you to these men and every one of their comrades in uniform.
The honourable member for Algoma, Manitoulin, Kapuskasing.
Mr. Speaker, in stark contrast to the Conservatives' fend-for-yourself philosophy, Liberals believe that poverty affects everyone, and governments have a moral responsibility to help springboard Canadians to success, dignity and independence. The Liberal leader is showing leadership on poverty, outlining a bold vision committing to cut poverty by 30% and child poverty by 50% within 5 years of being elected. The chef libéral...
The Liberal leader demonstrated his strong leadership on this, outlining an ambitious vision committing to cut poverty by 30% and child poverty by 50% within 5 years of being elected.
Poor Liberals would create a making work pay benefit to lower the welfare wall and improve the child tax benefit to support families. Liberals would honour the historic Kelowna Accord that the Conservatives cut and would work with all levels of government on affordable housing and universal childcare. Mr. Speaker, I believe that when we invest in Canadians, Canada succeeds socially and economically. I ask my colleagues on the other side to take this issue seriously and work towards ending poverty now.
The honourable member for Calgary East.
Mr. Speaker, Kenya's government and opposition signed a power-sharing agreement yesterday to end the post-election crisis that plunged the country into its worst turmoil since independence. Canada is hopeful that the power-sharing agreement will lead to peace and stability, as well as leave the foundations for a strong and democratic Kenya. Canada has repeatedly called upon Kenya's political leaders to come together in direct discussions to end the crisis and to put its weight behind Kofi Annan's mediation efforts. The Government of Canada also announced in January that it would provide up to $4.3 million in humanitarian assistance to those affected by the post-election violence. Mr. Speaker, we want to thank the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan and the AU Chairman for their efforts, and we look forward to working with the Government of Kenya in facing the challenges ahead for their country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Argenteuil-Papineau-Mirabel. Mr. Speaker, we learned when the budget was read that the government would make permanent the transfer of the gasoline tax to municipality. In and of itself, that's good news, but it doesn't add any additional money to renovate city infrastructure where it's greatly needed. this government refused to increase the reimbursement to municipalities to the equivalent of 5 cents on the gas tax by 2008-09. This would represent $1 billion for all our municipalities, which are far too much in debt. The Bloc Québécois is asking the government to reconsider since it can afford it. Considering that city revenue is not the same as that of other levels of government, why not adopt the Bloc's suggestion so that the share of municipalities be set at 15%, provinces 35%, and the federal government 50%? These are the proposals that are in the interests of Quebec municipalities.
Lanark, Frontenac, Lennoxon, Addington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday it was a particular pleasure for our Prime Minister to meet with Czech Prime Minister Mirek Topolanek here in Ottawa, for this is the 40th anniversary of the Prague Spring, and also, sadly, of the subsequent communist invasion and crackdown. Czechs can nowadays travel freely in the world, and I'm happy to report that last year Canada removed all visa requirements for visitors from the Czech Republic. Our two countries share a commitment to a principled foreign policy that promotes freedom, democracy, and human rights. Therefore, on the 40th anniversary of the Prague Spring, let us remember not only the past victims of European communism, but also the victims of present-day communism who are still persecuted, imprisoned in gulags and re-education camps, and tortured or murdered for the high crime of believing in human freedom. And, in honor of the Czech nation, which blazed the path to freedom that so many others have subsequently followed, let us offer a warm welcome to a friend of Canada and a friend of freedom as he visits our capital.
The Honourable Member for Mississauga, Brampton South.
Mr. Speaker, what does this government have against Ontario? In everything they do, Ontario is the one being shortchanged. Bill C-22 reduces our representation in Parliament. Their manufacturing fund does nothing to help manufacturers. The infrastructure plan, although stolen from the Liberals, is shamefully underfunded. Our economy is in crisis, our cities are crumbling, and our most basic democratic right to representation is being undermined. And yet, what happens, Mr. Speaker, when the Premier of Ontario, seeing his province being dealt one slight after another, dares to question this Conservative government? The same thing that happens to anyone who challenges the wisdom of the Conservative Party. He is denigrated, mocked, and ultimately ignored. In my own riding, Mayor Hazel McCallion pleaded for public transit funding that long had been promised. The Finance Minister openly mocked her for it. It took months of hand-wringing by Mississauga Liberals to finally get the government to keep its promise. Mr. Speaker, I don't like what I'm seeing here. Ontario deserves better. Canada deserves better.
Right on.
Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Mr. Speaker, last week I had the opportunity to travel to Iqaluit in Nunavut to see the conditions in which women are living in the north of the country. I met with the Nunavut Status of Women Minister, Leona Agluklak, who explained the issues faced by women in the territory. I went to a meeting where the Iqaluit Women's Council explained the work they are doing with these women and the constraints of the vastness and isolation of that territory bring about. I had the honor to visit one of the aid centers for battered women. It also enabled me to announce a program for partnership with Status of Women Canada to the tune of $1.5 million, allowing the YWCA to make a difference for these women who need it so much. This is a perfect example of the work done by Status of Women Canada. I salute the women I met during these wonderful meetings, and I pay particular tribute to all these women who broke the silence on violence.
Parkdale High Park.
Mr. Speaker, today the front page of the Globe and Mail confirms what Canadians saw quite clearly in this week's budget, that this Conservative government does not care about our cultural sector and that it's actively undermining our artists and their capacity to create. The headline article includes the boasting of evangelical lobbyists who successfully convinced Conservative ministers and MPs to root out artistic works they disagree with. Canadian Heritage officials confirmed yesterday they'll be expanding the criteria used for denying tax credits to artists. What they're doing, Mr. Speaker, is called censorship. They're trying to silence voices that diverge from their political agenda. Mr. Speaker, we can stop this attack on our artists. Unfortunately, as the Toronto Star says today, the official opposition, and I'm quoting, repeatedly turned itself into a Conservative doormat. It's time to stand up for Canada's artists and Canadian culture against ideological attacks by this government.
The Honourable Member for Scarborough Rouge River.
Mr. Speaker, Canada and the world community have taken note of new violence in Sri Lanka following the Sri Lankan government's decision to suspend the peace process. At a recent community forum hosted in Scarborough on the continuing conflict in Sri Lanka, members of the Sri Lankan Canadian community expressed their desire that Canada consult with the community here in developing a Canadian policy position on this issue, which could offer more leadership in fostering a peaceful and equitable resolution to the conflict. Moving forward with such would require the invitation and cooperation of the government of Sri Lanka. Many have concluded that a military solution to this conflict is not viable, and a renewed civil war would entail losses of life and levels of violence and destruction unacceptable by modern standards. Canadians know that peoples of different language, culture, religion, and race can live and prosper and share a country together, but must have the political will and leadership to do so. I urge all parties to the conflict in Sri Lanka to renew and redouble their efforts at implementing reforms and avoiding violence in achieving a resolution with peaceful means.
Honourable Member for Brossard-la-Prairie. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In its 2008 budget, the Conservative government has maintained its inertia with regard to global warming. On many occasions, scientists, economists, and business people have denounced the inaction of this government and demanded that it urgently adopt a true environmental policy. Rather than taking energetic measures right away and taking the action necessary to truly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the Conservative government has pushed back to 2010 the coming into force of its regulatory framework, which is based almost exclusively on intensity targets, which are advantageous for the oil industry and so weak that they do not provide for any true reductions in greenhouse gases. While other countries such as Great Britain and France have adopted concrete measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, this Conservative government continues to refuse to act responsibly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Ottawa South.
Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government preaches accountability but practices Mulroney-style ethics. The Environment Minister embroils himself in the bribery scandal of a mayoral candidate and meddles in Ottawa city politics by killing its light rail project. The Finance Minister hands his friends untendered six-figure contracts. The Industry Minister breaks copyright law and demands a gag order on the settlement. The Conservatives play shell games with cash to exceed campaign spending limits and then try desperately to shut down the inquiry looking into it. The Prime Minister's communications advisor advises Public Works to stop suing a Conservative bagman. And the Prime Minister's bagmen try to buy off candidate after candidate after candidate whenever and wherever it suits them. Mr. Speaker, my Liberal colleagues and I have a responsibility in this House to shine a bright light on the cold, dark back room of the Conservative Party. It's what Canadians expect of us, and it's exactly what we're going to deliver.
Honourable Member for Winnipeg South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canadian students are pleased to see another budget that invests in their education and their futures. Budget 2008 launches a new Consolidated Canada Student Grant Program to coincide with the wind-down of the Millennium Scholarship Foundation. The new program will provide certainty and predictability for Canadian families. Furthermore, Budget 2008 provides an additional $21 million over 2 years to establish up to 20 Global Excellence Research Chairs. This will strengthen the ability of our universities to attract and retain top science leaders. This helps outstanding institutions like the University of Manitoba, in my riding of Winnipeg South. Investing in these universities brings a great return. And with our government's support for post-secondary education rising to $9.7 billion in 2008 and 2009, Canadians in my province and across the country can take pride in the growth we'll see now and in the future. After 13 years of Liberal mismanagement, Canada finally has a government that is getting the job done for students.
Vote for news. Oral questions. Questions orales. The Honourable Member for Wascana.
Thank you, Mr. Donna Cadman has repeatedly confirmed that Conservatives offered her husband life insurance benefits to buy his vote. Yesterday, Mrs. Cadman was asked if she considered it a bribe, and she said yes. Her daughter says the same thing. Under the existing parliamentary life insurance plan, if members cease to be MPs, they can keep their insurance, but the premiums go up and the benefits go down. Did the Conservatives offer to make up that difference in exchange for Mr. Cadman's vote? Was that the offer?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works and Government Service.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in fact, no offer was made. Chuck Cabin said this himself on the record, national televised interviews, 2 of them, as a matter of fact, both with CTV and with Global. The meeting that took place, there were 3 people at that meeting. All 3 people at the meeting said that no offer was in fact made. Chuck Cabin, we all know he was an honourable man. He was a man of his word. We should respect his word and accept his word on this very issue.
Honourable Member for Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, the government attacks the word of Mrs. Cadman, but her story is consistent. It's confirmed by her daughter and by the Prime Minister's own words. In an interview taped in 2005, he was asked explicitly about the insurance offer. He did not deny it. In fact, he confirmed an offer was made. He confirmed it was about, quote, financial insecurity, not about a nomination. He told Conservative officials to, quote, make the case to Mr. Cadman. Did the Prime Minister know that that would be an indictable offence under the Criminal Code?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, the member for Wascana is, as usual, misrepresenting what, in fact, the Prime Minister, what then Leader of the Opposition, did, in fact, say. And, in fact, Chuck Cabin, the member for Wascana wasn't at the meeting. There were 3 people who were at the meeting. All 3 people said that no offer was made. And my colleague doesn't have to take my word for it. Chuck Cabin, on a nationally televised interview on May 21st, 2005, on Global, he said, quote, in the answer to a question, did he offer you a deal? He said, quote, no, absolutely nothing. There was never any deal offered.
The Honourable Member for Wascana.
Mr. Speaker, the government cannot escape by twisting an interview with Mr. Cadman totally out of context. The Conservatives admit to a meeting on May the 19th, which talked about party nominations. That's not the issue. The issue is the previous meeting with Mr. Cadman, which talked about financial insecurity and life insurance. That meeting was not on the 19th. It was on May 17th. That's the meeting, a financial meeting, confirmed in the Prime Minister's taped interview. Why was the Prime Minister so concerned about his taped conversation being published? What did he want to keep secret?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Liberals actually started the line of questioning on this subject very well. They said that Chuck Cabin was an honourable, honest, and decent man. He managed to do something that is actually very rare in Canadian politics. He got elected based on his own name, his own reputation as a good, decent, and honest man. His word was his bond, and his word on this subject was that no deal was offered. I wish the Liberals would go back to where they began on this file, accept that Chuck Cabin was an honest and honourable man, that no deal was offered, because that is, in fact, the truth.
The Honourable Member for St. Boniface. Order.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is the one who came forward with the Accountability Act, but he didn't assume his responsibilities by offering the arrangements to ex-Cabinet. This proves this is so. The members of his party visited Cabinet to offer a bribe on the eve of the vote. The Prime Minister did not assume his responsibility by allowing these people to act illegally. Why didn't the Prime Minister do everything he could to prevent this crime from occurring? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works. My colleague can invent his story all he wants, but the facts are facts, and here are the facts. There were no offers made to Mr. Cabin. Mr. Cabin said this himself, so we should take his word as truth. The Honourable Member for St. Boniface. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister didn't ask whether it was moral or legal to offer a $1 million insurance policy. A dying man was given this offer. Was it not the Prime Minister's responsibility to ensure that his confidence should not have acted in this manner? Why did the Prime Minister only ask the following question? You're not going to publish that. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
For this case, and that is my honourable colleague was not at the meeting. None of the Liberal members were at the meeting. They had their own meetings with Chuck Cabin when they were trying to persuade him to cross the floor to the Liberal Party and to vote their way on the budget. But the meeting that we're talking about here, there were 3 people at the meeting. All 3 of them said that no offer was made. That's the simple fact. I'm sorry if it doesn't jibe with the Liberal political tactic here, but it is the truth, and the truth in this case is unassailable. There was no offer made.
The Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, in the Cabinet affair, the defence of the Prime Minister's offense was that what he offered to Mr. Cadman to get him to change his vote back in 2005 concerned his nomination. That's what he said here in the House. But this was contradicted by Mr. Cadman's wife and daughter, who both confirmed that two representatives from the Conservative Party offered him a $1 million insurance policy. Does the Prime Minister recognize that this shows the real face of his government, which is not any better than what the Liberals used to be? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Public Works. My colleague should not attack the integrity of Mr. Cadman. Mr. Cadman said that there was no offer. There were three people who were at this meeting. Each of those three individuals said that there were no offers made. Those are the facts. The Honourable Member for Joliette. Mr. Speaker, it's not just Mr. Cadman's wife and daughter who contradict the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister contradicts himself in a recording that we all heard on the media, where he said that he was aware of the fact that financial considerations were offered to Mr. Cadman by legitimate representatives of the Conservative Party. How can the Prime Minister not stop his members from trying to buy Mr. Cadman's vote? This is against the Criminal Code of Canada and the Act of Parliament. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary, the Minister of Public Works. There were three people at this meeting, and one of the three meetings was not my colleague from the bloc. Each of the three individuals at the meeting said that there were no offers made. That's simple, that's clear, and that's Mr. Cadman's word. Those are the facts. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister said that a guarantee was offered to Mr. Cadman to be a candidate during the next election, and yet in 2005 the Prime Minister revealed himself that an offer had been made to Mr. Cadman to compensate any financial losses associated with an election. Two versions for the same effects. Will the Prime Minister admit that any type of offer made to Mr. Cadman, if indeed an offer was made, that it was an attempt made at corruption? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Or two very different things. There was, in fact, a conversation about Chuck Cadman rejoining the Conservative Party. Chuck was a long friend of mine. He was a member of Parliament, first elected in 1997 from a neighbouring riding. We wanted him to be a member of the Conservative caucus, and the Prime Minister made a recommendation to him that he rejoin the Conservative Party as he was previously a member, so he could be a candidate for us in the coming campaign. What he's talking about here in terms of impropriety is, in fact, not true. She was not at that meeting. There was no offer that was tabled. Chuck Cadman himself said so. She ought to accept the word of Chuck Cadman.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, it's not because the financial offers made to Mr. Cadman and confirmed by the Prime Minister did not lead to the wished-for results, that there was no attempt made at corruption. The Prime Minister, is he aware of the fact that the offer made by representatives, official representatives of the Conservative Party, to a member for the purpose of buying his vote is, in fact, illegal? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works. The problem with these questions is that there were no offers made. Mr. Cadman said it himself on two national TV programs. He said there were no offers made. The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
New Democrats are deeply concerned by reports that the Conservatives are planning to censor film and video production in Canada to suit their friends from the religious right. Will the Minister of Heritage confirm that her office is working on, quote, updated eligibility requirements and standardized and updated list of illegal and other ineligible content? Can the Minister assure this House and Canada's cultural community that her department will not place any new barriers to accessing film tax credits in Canada? Will she give that assurance today?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, filmmakers are free to make movies as they see fit as long as they are within the law. But the Canadian taxpayer should not be forced to pay for material that is gratuitously violent or denigrating to identifiable groups. The government simply reintroduced the same tax measure in an omnibus bill, and by the way, that party, along with all parties, voted in favour of the law.
Member for Vancouver East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Parliamentary Secretary knows full well that the bill in question doesn't reveal the Conservatives' plan to censor Canadian film. Rather, it's the guidelines that the department is drafting that would create a Canadian film censorship board, a board that would decide what film and video content is worthy and what is not. So does the minister agree that there can be no role for the Canadian government to censor the film censorship in Canada? Will she assure Canadians that any plans to curtail artistic freedom will be stopped immediately? No censorship.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, it's regrettable that the NDP member is trying to make something out of nothing. The fact is that the tax measure is nothing new. The fact is that that party, along with every party in this House, passed the bill. She should have known what was in the bill in the first place. I should note that it originally came to this House in 2003 under the Liberals. At that particular point, there is nothing new. What is the story here? I don't understand, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Vancouver Centre.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister and members of his government deliberately tried to confuse Canadians. According to the book, the distasteful offer to bribe Mr. Cadman was made with the Prime Minister's approval on May the 17th. There was another meeting on May the 19th, but the bribe was offered on May the 17th. Who represented the Prime Minister at the May 17th meeting? And what was offered to Mr. Cadman?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works. Order.
Mr. Speaker, there was one meeting that took place with Mr. Cadman because we wanted him to rejoin the Conservative Party. Chuck Cadman was a long-standing friend of many of our colleagues here. In fact, he supported the Prime Minister when he ran for the Conservative Party leadership. He was a long-standing friend of the current Prime Minister, so there was a meeting to encourage him to rejoin the Conservative Party. With regard to the budget vote and what's being alleged here is in fact not true, and Chuck Cadman himself said so in 2 nationally televised interviews. He said that no offer was made.
Honourable Member for Vancouver Centre.
As usual, Mr. Speaker, the first reaction of this government is to say anything but the truth. Yesterday, they said Mr. Cadman's wife and daughter were not telling the truth. They pretended that the only meeting with Mr. Cadman took place on May the 19th. But there was a meeting on May the 17th where a $1 million bribe was offered. It was organized by the Minister of Natural Resources, and the Prime Minister knew about it. So I repeat the question. Who represented the Prime Minister at the meeting with Mr. Cadman on May the 17th?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
I didn't know my colleague from Vancouver Centre has the ability to transform herself into a fly and fly into a door and go onto a wall and be at a meeting that she had no part in whatsoever. So she claims that there was definitely a meeting and this was discussed. She's wrong. There was a meeting that took place. All 3 people at the meeting said that no offer was made. The only discussion that took place was our desire to have Chuck Cadman rejoin the Conservative Party and continue his support of the then Leader of the Opposition and now the Prime Minister of Canada. Chuck Cadman said no offer was made. I hope my friend from Vancouver Centre will accept Chuck Cadman's word if she doesn't accept mine.
Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca.
Mr. Speaker, an offer was made. The Prime Minister's words were caught on tape, and when specifically asked about the Mr. Speaker.
Order. Order. The noise level's been excessive, in my view, throughout question period, and now, order. And now I can't hear anything. We have to have some order in the House. We have opportunity. Order. I'd encourage members who want to have discussions, like perhaps the member for Wascana and the member for Peterborough, to go out into the foyer of the House and have their discussions out there while question period goes on in the House. It's very difficult. Yes, I can see the Chief Government Whip is suggesting the member for Abbotsford might like to carry on some discussions outside as well. And I agree, this could be done, and there are several members on both sides who seem to constantly make excessive noise while we're going on with questions. We're now into a question, and we'll have an answer, and I hope we'll have a little more quiet. The Honourable Member for Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca, has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, an offer was made. The Prime Minister's words were caught on tape, and when specifically asked about the $1 million insurance policy, did he deny it? No, he did not. He said, quote, "Of the offer to Chuck, it was only to replace financial considerations." He goes on to say, the Conservative envoys who are legitimately representing the party. Those are the facts. So will the Prime Minister come clean with Canadians on his role in this sordid affair and agree to tell everything he knows to the RCMP? It's pretty clear.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works. Order.
As I say, yesterday when the first question on this came up from the Leader of the Opposition, he started off by saying Chuck Cadman is an honourable man. Everybody in the House gave him a standing ovation, including the member from Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca. Chuck Cadman said no offer was made. The member from Esquimalt just said an offer was made. In doing so, he is saying that Chuck Cadman is a liar. That's what he is saying now. Chuck Cadman said no offer was made. He said it in 2 nationally televised interviews. That's the truth. That's the fact. Accept it, Keith.
Honourable member for Esquimalt, Wanda Fuca.
Mr. Speaker, maybe the honourable member ought to speak to his own Prime Minister, who has admitted an offer was made, and such an offer is a criminal offence. Mr. Speaker, his own words were already captured on tape, and they prove he knew about the plan to offer the bribe. My question, Mr. Speaker, to the member, can the Prime Minister table any proof that there was an internal investigation into the actions of the officials, or will he just admit that there wasn't an investigation because he condoned it right from the start?
Exactly. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, again, there's one central fact here that the Liberals refuse to accept. There's a simple and obvious fact. There were 3 people at the meeting. All 3 of them said that no offer was made. It's simple, it's clear, it's obvious, it's on the record. Chuck Cadman said so in nationally televised interviews on both Global and CTV, and my friend from Esquimalt knows that Chuck Cadman is an honourable man. He wouldn't go on national television to lie about this file. He spoke the truth. He said there was no offer. I hope my colleague accepts his word.
That's the truth.
The Honourable Member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges. Mr. Speaker, political meddling occurred in the Prime Minister's office, and it's not because the wheelings and dealings have failed that there was no meddling. We talk about several meetings. Mr. Soudas with Fortier and his cabinet, isn't that the proof of this hypocrisy and duplicity of this government? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, the record is clear. No preferential treatment was given to the parties concerned. It's clear, it's simple. The Honourable Member for Vaudreuil-Soulanges. The Minister, Michael Fortier, said yesterday when he left the committee that pressure was put on by the Prime Minister's office, but that he was the Minister. Michael Fortier has confessed that there has been political meddling. Does the Prime Minister recognize that his many interventions between his office and is a very definition of political interference? The Honourable Government House Leader. There was no political meddling or interference. It is clear that no preferential treatment was given. And I would like to quote Jean Lapierre, who said, in all consciousness, I must say that after hearing the report, I don't see any smoking gun. I don't see any scandal. It's like all the other so-called scandals that we've been hearing about from the opposition. The Honourable Member for Saint-Bruno, Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, the Ethics Committee just finished a very important step. We've collected information. We've concluded our hearings. In January, the Prime Minister said publicly that he will be setting up a commission of inquiry as soon as the hearings are completed. However, the hearings are over. Will the Prime Minister keep his word and appoint as quickly as possible a commissioner to get this public inquiry underway? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, the government asked Professor Johnston as an independent third party to study the issue and to follow up on some recommendations with respect to the mandate. We are waiting for the final report from the Ethics Committee so that Professor Johnston can fine-tune his work and make recommendations for the public inquiry. The Honourable Member for Saint-Bruno, Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, we shouldn't wait for the final report. The Prime Minister promised that he would begin this commission of inquiry once the committee hearings were over. So the time is now. If he wants to keep his word, he'll have to act? Will the Prime Minister give as broad a mandate as possible to this Commission of Inquiry in order to shed light on the Airbus affair and all this inquiry into the suspicions that are lying over the Conservative Party, the government House Leader? Mr. Speaker, we said that Professor Johnson will be examining the Ethics Committee report. The opposition members have said that this report has to be done to help the public inquiry, and so we're waiting for the final report from the Ethics Committee.
Member for Don Valley East.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister claimed there is absolutely no truth to the story that Mr. Cadman was offered life insurance benefits to change his vote. But Mr. Cadman's daughter Jody says the offer was indeed made, and her mother Donna confirms the story. Why is the Conservative government dishonouring the reputation of the Cadman family by suggesting all 3 family members were liars?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, it wasn't just the Prime Minister that said that no offer was made. Chuck Cadman also made the statement as well. On May 21st, 2005, I'll be glad to table this in the House if my colleague doesn't think I'm reading it correctly. The question from Tara Nelson of Global Television asked the question to Chuck Cadman, quote, "You had a meeting with the Prime Minister prior to the vote. Did he ever offer you a deal?" No, absolutely nothing. There was never any deal. And the same with Harper. Yeah, same with Harper.
The Honourable Member for Don Valley East.
Mr. Speaker, what is pathetic is that this Prime Minister wraps himself in accountability. But yesterday, the Prime Minister and the junior Public Works Minister tried to discredit Chuck Cadman's widow. Why would Donna Cadman make up a story about Conservatives offering her husband a bribe? And Jody Cadman is also confirming this $1 million bribe. Have they no shame? Why would members of the Chuck Cadman family lie?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Well, why would the member opposite, the day after she gave a standing ovation saying that Chuck Cadman is an honourable man, now get in the House and essentially call Chuck Cadman a liar? That's the question that I have for my member opposite. She's alleging something here that is in fact not true. Chuck Cadman said on the record twice in nationally televised interviews that no offer was made. I hope my colleague from Don Valley, I think she knew Chuck Cadman, and she knew him well enough that he wouldn't mislead about this. He was honest, he was clear, he was direct. He told the clear truth. No offer was made except the truth.
Listen to Chuck's
Honourable Member for Ajax Pickering.
Was the Parliamentary Secretary saying that he had lied to his family, that Donna Cadman was a liar? Is that what he's saying in this House?
I think so.
When an MP leaves public office, they are allowed to take their life insurance policy and convert it into a private one through Industrial Alliance Insurance. They're able to go through this conversion process to update and adjust benefits without having to take a medical. It's very costly, but possible. Can the minister confirm that the documents Doug Finley and Tom Flanagan prepared for Chuck Cadman were from Industrial Alliance Insurance, and that their offer was to have the Conservative Party assume payments for a $1 million payout?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Well, Mr. Speaker, no Liberal farce is ever fully complete without a cameo appearance from the member from Pickering Ajax. So here we go. The reality is here, Chuck Cadman said that no offer was made. He's made that very clear. My colleague should accept Chuck Cadman's word and just accept the truth.
The Honourable Member for Ajax Pickering.
Our questions are not about the May 19th meeting. The question is about what happened on May 17th, the date 2 Conservative operatives met with Chuck Cadman in his parliamentary office to present him with a $1 million bribe. Will the Prime Minister admit now what he has already admitted on tape in 2005, that there was a bribe, that they tried to buy a vote, buy this Parliament, and that they will do anything, break any rule, bribe anyone for power?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
No, I think he's looking in the mirror when he's making that description, Mr. Speaker. We know what happened with the Liberals on that budget vote with a member for Newmarket Aurora who all of a sudden found herself in cabinet voting in favour of the Liberal budget. Our government and our party, we made no offer to Chuck Cadman that was in any way inappropriate. We had a desire to have Chuck Cadman rejoin the Conservative Party. The member for Pickering-Ajax is doing what he usually does. He takes a little bit from here, a little bit from there, a little bit from there, tries to mash it together into some kind of a conspiracy, and as usual, he falls flat in his face, and he's going to do so again on this file.
Honourable member for Ancaster, Dundas, Flamborough, Westdale.
Mr. Speaker, there's news this morning that the Canadian forces have resumed transferring Taliban prisoners to the Afghan authorities. These transfers have been stopped last November because of concerns the military had about the conditions in Afghan prisons. The Liberals had feigned interest on this issue in the past, but today it's not politically expedient to ask a question. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence tell the House why the Canadian military has resumed transferring Taliban prisoners and what changes have been made to give them the assurance that these prisoners will be handled in a manner that is consistent with Afghanistan's international obligations?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I can confirm that the military has announced in theatre this morning that operational decision has been made to resume transfer of Taliban prisoners. The transfer agreement we have with the Afghan government remains in place and it's working. The decision to transfer prisoners remains an operational matter made by the military commanders on a case-by-case basis in the field. Mr. Speaker, since last November, well over $1 million has been spent improving conditions in the prisons that hold Canadian transferred prisoners. There have been training of guards, training of police. Canadian officials have increased their monitoring visits to the prisons. Mr. Speaker, Canadian Forces is confident these changes have addressed the issues at hand and they'll continue to monitor the situation.
Very good. The Honourable Member for Sackville Eastern Shore.
Mr. Speaker, in 2005, in the month of June, the then Prime Minister promised Joyce Carter, a widow of Cape Breton, that if the Conservatives formed government, they would immediately extend the VIP program to all widows of World War II and Korean veterans. The first two budgets, absolutely nothing. This budget, 1/3 of what is required is in the budget, meaning, Mr. Speaker, that 70% of widows of World War II and Korean veterans will not qualify. Joyce Carter of Cape Breton is watching the TV now. Will someone in the government please stand up, face the camera, and tell what...
Order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, we're now allocating almost $800 million a year more than what the Liberals budgeted for in their last year in office.
Very good.
In 3 budgets, the Conservative government has allocated $1.6 billion more for our veterans. We have also delivered on our promise to implement the new Veterans Charter, establish a Bill of Rights for veterans, appoint a Veterans Ombudsman, and to resolve the long-standing Agent Orange issue. I might also note, Mr. Speaker, that the member who has just spoken did not support any of those initiatives for veterans.
Honourable Member for Sackville Eastern
Speaker,
Shore.
it's rather hypocritical coming from these bunch of political sycophants. When the NDP moved the Veterans First motion, which would have helped every veteran and their family in this country, they were the only party to vote against it, Mr. Speaker. Shame on them. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, they denied many people from the Agent Orange compensation. They changed the rules. They promised everyone. They misled them. They said the system clawback would end when they formed government. Now they misled 70% of these widows. Mr. Speaker, these widows were the caregivers of our greatest heroes. Why did this government deliberately mislead Mrs. Carter and all the widows in this country?
Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the fact that last year we added 12,000 veterans and their widows to the program VIP. This year, we have now added another 12,000 with the $282 million that we've put forward in the budget. The sad record of the NDP is quite clear. They voted against the ex gratia payments for our Agent Orange. They voted against doubling our operational stress injury clinics. They voted against hiring frontline staff.
Shame.
They voted against funding for the Veterans Ombudsman.
Shame.
And they voted against the Veterans Bill of Rights.
Shameful.
That gentleman should sit.
The Honourable Member for Hoyle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's be clear. We are looking for more information about a meeting on May 17th, 2005, when 2 Conservative representatives met with Mr. Cadman. Will the government confirm that Mr. Flanagan and Mr. Finlay met with Chuck Cadman in his office on May 17th? And will they reconfirm, as the Prime Minister has said in a recording, that they were aware of the $1 million bribe? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works. A meeting was held because we wanted Mr. Cadman to rejoin our political party. That's what was discussed at the meeting. What my colleague and the Liberal Party are doing are trying to reinvent this story. There were no financial inducements, and Mr. Cadman said that nothing was on the table. He said that himself, and we should take his words as the truth. The Honourable Member for Hull-Aylmer. Mr. Speaker, when a reporter questioned the Prime Minister about the $1 million insurance policy offered to Chuck Cadman, he didn't respond what insurance policy. He didn't say there was no insurance policy. Instead of doing that, the Prime Minister confirmed that he knew that there had been discussions, and then he asked if his statement would be published. If no bribe was offered, then why did the Prime Minister not simply say that? Why did the Prime Minister not simply deny it? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Media interviews on this file, Mr. Speaker. There were two, in fact, media interviews for which there is video, and it's clear, they're unedited, and they're out there and they're available for my colleague to read. There were three people who were at this meeting: Tom Flanagan, Doug Finlay, and Chuck Cadman himself. Chuck Cadman, and all three of them have said that no offer was made that was in any way inappropriate. And in fact, I encourage my colleague. One of the interviews was done by Global National by Tara Nelson, where Chuck Cadman says, "quote No, there was never any deal offered." The other interview was on Mike Duffy Live, CTV National Television, on May 19th, 2005, where he said, "quote There were no offers." That's Chuck Cadman. That's his word.
Member for Halton.
Speaker, when I was a Conservative Member of Parliament, before that party threw me out, I heard the Prime...
Order. 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 I'm sure the Honourable Member for Halton appreciates all the help with this question, but we have to be able to hear it and not the other questions. So the Honourable Member for Halton has the floor. Order.
Thank you, Speaker. When I was a Conservative Member of Parliament, I heard the Prime Minister call Chuck Cadman a poor MP. The Prime Minister said Mr. Cadman was more concerned with ethics and with the country than he was with political organization. Mr. Speaker, I have always wondered why the Prime Minister was so angry at the late Chuck Cadman, but now we know a lot more. Was it simply because he could not be bribed?
Exactly. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, how dare the member from Halton never served with Chuck Cadman. He didn't know Chuck Cadman. Chuck Cadman supported the Prime Minister when he was Leader of the Opposition, supported him in his leadership races. The Prime Minister wanted him to rejoin the Conservative Party. Chuck Cadman was a dear friend of mine from a neighbouring riding, and we always supported Chuck Cadman. He was a fantastic human being, a great member of Parliament, and a dear friend. He has no proof, he has no evidence that the Prime Minister ever said that about Chuck Cadman. That's outrageous. We honour Chuck Cadman's memory. He was a dear friend. The member from Halton should withdraw that ridiculous question and statement.
Order. An order, the Honourable Member for Halton.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if that's how you treat your dear friends, I'm glad I'm not on that side of the aisle anymore.
Order. The Honourable Member for Halton. Order. Has the floor for a question. We'd better get on with the question. Order.
Speaker. Speaker.
Order. I urge the Honourable Member from Halton to proceed immediately with his question. We'd better get on with it.
Speaker, when a journalist at the time in 2005 taped the Prime Minister asking him about this incident, the Prime Minister said, "I don't know the details. I just know there were discussions. My question is to the Right Honourable Prime Minister. Was he deceiving the journalists then, or has he been shamming the House yesterday?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works.
Mr. Speaker, the issue on this is very clear. Chuck Cadman himself said there was no deal. And we remember well when the member from Halton was a member of the Conservative caucus, and our government has never been more on track, never been more focused, never been more effective. Then we kicked him out and threw him back into the Liberal Party where he belongs. And he can stay over there, and he can have him all he wants. When we threw him out of the Conservative Party, Mr. Speaker, he said on national interviews, he said, why are they throwing me out? I don't get it. He wanted to stay in the Conservative caucus. With questions like that, he knows clearly why we want nothing to do with Garth Turner.
Order. The honourable member,
The honourable member for Châteauguay, Saint-Constant. Mr. Speaker, the media have told us this morning that the transfer of detainees in Kandahar had resumed. According to a colonel in the Canadian Army, the relevance of each transfer will be evaluated case by case. What guarantee did the Minister of Defence obtain from Afghan authorities in order to ensure that these transferred detainees will not be tortured? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, and as I said previously, for the last 4 months or so since November, we've been working hard with the Afghans in this area. We've put over $1 million into improvements into the prisons. We've been training Afghan guards, Afghan National Police Force. We've had more visits by Canadian representatives over there. We're continuing to work with our Afghan allies to ensure that the system works as it's been doing more recently, and we'll just continue to do that.
The Honourable Member for Châteauguay Saint-Constant. In having the transfer depend on the characteristics of each detainee, is this not proof that there's no guarantee by Afghan authorities and that the decision will be based on the willingness of the Canadian forces, and they will decide whether or not to respect the obligations taken on by Canada under the Geneva Convention? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
And I thank my honourable member for the question again. The fact that Canadian Forces takes all their obligations very seriously. They evaluate them on a case-by-case basis because they do take it so seriously. They want to make sure that each Taliban prisoner is treated in accordance with the obligations, in accordance with the rule of law, in accordance with the procedures and the agreement that we have in place with the Afghan authorities, and in accordance with all the improvements that we made recently in the system, which will make the system work a lot better, and the honourable member should be happy with that.
The honourable member for Mount Royal.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, the transfer of detainees had been suspended because of allegations of torture and abuse, and the federal court expressed serious concerns about these transfers. Now that the transfers have resumed, what new measures have been taken, other than the ones that have been mentioned today, in order to guarantee that these will be in keeping with international law and will meet the concerns of the federal court? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question, and at the risk of repeating myself, we worked very hard in the last 4 months to make specific changes in terms of the facility, in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the training that's given to Afghan National Police, into their judicial system, into the guard training program. We're doing more visits to the Afghan prisons by Canadian officials. The Canadian Forces takes all of their obligations very seriously. We rely on them to exercise judgment, and I think we have put our reliance in good hands. The Canadian Forces are doing a great job, and we should thank them for that.
The honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Mr. Speaker, on February the 26th, the Minister of Finance tabled our Conservative government's third balanced budget. It is unfortunate that the opposition hasn't read it. On Wednesday, the member for London Fanshawe showed her lack of understanding when she questioned whether the budget had anything for women. Can the Minister of Canadian Heritage, Status of Women in Official Languages, clarify for the member and the House what the budget has for the women of Canada?
The Honourable Secretary.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our government has not only increased the Status of Women budget by 76%, which is the highest
level yet, but in the 2008 budget, our government has stated that it will go forward with this initiative by having the first action plan for the status of women to ensure equality of women in Canada, thanks to an improvement in their economic and social conditions and a greater participation in democratic life. Mr. Speaker, for us, equality isn't only symbolic, but it is real.
Valley.
Speaker, the environment simply isn't a part of this Conservative agenda, as is proven in last week's budget. There's nothing in the budget to take on the big polluters. And as the Toronto Star said, the Liberals have turned themselves into a doormat in the process. In fact, instead of reducing pollution, this budget is going to take hard-earned tax dollars from working families and give it to oil companies. More subsidies, more tax breaks, and nothing to protect hard-working families. When will this government finally find the courage to stand up to their oil patch buddies?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's ironic from that member who's going to be voting against the budget, a budget, Mr. Speaker, that provides $500 million for modern public transit that will contribute to cleaner air and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Mr. Speaker, the NDP, Mr. Speaker, are guilty of the sin of greenwashing, which, Mr. Speaker, is false bills, false press proclamations that they care about the environment. But, Mr. Speaker, when they have an opportunity to vote for a cleaner environment, they're constantly voting against good environmental practices.
The honourable member for Skeena Bulkley Valley.
After that answer, Mr. Speaker, Canadians are going to have to take a shower. The Conservative Liberal budget will sink hundreds of millions of dollars into polluting and unsafe industries like the tar sands and nuclear. This action is not only morally corrupt, it's intellectually bankrupt. New Democrats are ready to take on the big polluters, and we have a plan. It's called the Clean Air and Climate Change Act. When will the Conservatives abandon their pollution agenda and bring this critical bill back for a free vote in the House of Commons and finally do something about climate change?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of the Environment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that the Environment Committee over the last month and a half, the NDP time and time again have heard from witnesses that their plan is all hot air, Mr. Speaker. No action, Mr. Speaker, and it would, Mr. Speaker, not stand up a constitutional challenge. Mr. Speaker, we now have a government that reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by 2020. Mr. Speaker, it's real. Mr. Speaker, why is the NDP voting against real action on the climate?
The honourable member for Mount Royal.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Defence, in his reply to the question of transfer of detainees, ignored numerous concerns expressed by the federal court, including missing detainees, denial of effective access to detention facilities, dubious reliability of Afghan investigations of mistreatment, post-transfer monitoring techniques that are not effective, and in particular, a serious systemic problem of detainee torture and abuse in Afghan prisons. Is the resumption not premature in light of these concerns, which the Minister has not addressed in his reply, particularly the systemic question of pervasive detainee abuse and torture? Where is the conformity with international law?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and again I thank my honourable colleague for his question. We are concerned about all those issues, and that's why we have an agreement in place with the Afghan government. It's why we have been working so hard for the last 4 months since those allegations surfaced to improve things in terms of training, in terms of monitoring. The system is working. We are relying on the Canadian forces in place. We're relying on the judgment of commanders. We think our reliance on their judgment is well placed. We trust the Canadian forces' judgment. They've never let us down yet, and they won't let us down in the future. And I wish my honourable member would appreciate that.
Honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Mr. Speaker, after 2 long years of delay and obstruction by the Liberals in the House of Commons and Senate, our tackling violent crime legislation is finally law. Today, families and communities across Canada can feel safer. Protecting the members of our society is a priority of this government, not an afterthought. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety say if there are any measures in this recent budget that can help protect the safety of Canadians?
Great question. Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and third good question from this side of the House today. And I'd like to thank my honourable colleague from Fleetwood Port Kells for her question. As you know, Mr. Speaker, Bill C-2 includes tough new penalties to crack down on gun criminals, repeat violent or sexual offenders, impaired drivers, and sexual predators targeting our youth. Budget 2008 builds on previous efforts to deliver funding by providing funding for provinces and territories to recruit 2,500 new frontline police officers. As British Columbia Finance Minister Carol Taylor thinks an aggressive recruitment program for young police officers is a good thing, and we agree.
The honourable member for Davenport.
Mr. Speaker, across the world, human rights groups and labour leaders continue to express their concerns about the ongoing situation in Iran. Recently, 2 labour leaders, Mansour Onsalou and Mahoud Salehi, were arrested and imprisoned as a result of their efforts to create fair and safe working conditions for Iranian workers. What has the Minister of Foreign Affairs done to help secure the release of these 2 labour leaders and to impress upon the Iranian government Canada's concern about the human rights violation in Iran?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Speaker, I want to thank the member for this question. This government is very concerned by the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran, including the increased persecution of minorities. As my colleagues may recall, last year, Canada successfully spearheaded a resolution at the UN highlighting the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in Iran, and we will continue to ensure that Canada makes its position very well known to the government of Iran about the situation of human rights in Iran. Thank you.
The honourable member for Gatineau. Mr. Speaker, the recent Conservative budget clearly illustrates once again the lack of respect by this government towards official language communities. In their action plan for official languages, there is no funding whatsoever, and the plan will end on March 31st. Will the minister responsible for official languages tell us why she has totally abandoned the official language communities, because there's nothing in the budget that meets their expectations? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our government is taking the necessary steps in the interests of language minority communities to ensure the vitality of French and English in Canada. We have a strategy for the next phase of the official languages. The amounts have not yet been determined because we are working on the official languages plan, on the second part of this plan, and as soon as it is made available, you will know at the proper time.
I would like to draw to the attention of honourable members the presence in the gallery of His Excellency Mirek Topolánek, Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. And I remind honourable members of the reception in room 216 with the Prime Minister, to which all honourable members are invited immediately. I would also like to draw to the attention of honourable members the presence in the gallery of Mr. Fred Chartrand, a Canadian press photographer who is retiring today after 38 years of service on Parliament Hill. Oh, we have some points of order. We'll start with the Honourable Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, during question period, I used certain unparliamentary terms, for which I apologize and which I retract. Good job.
I didn't know who the culprit was. I did hear some words that were inappropriate, and I'm pleased the Secretary of State has confessed. The Honourable member for Halton is rising on a point of order.
Thank you, Speaker. The Honourable Minister has beaten me to the points, and I would like to thank him very much for doing that, and I accept his apology.
The Honourable member for Abbotsford is rising on a point of order also.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on a point of order, and I do so very reluctantly because it involves another member of this House. As you know, Mr. Speaker, during question period, there's a 15-minute period in which we as members have the opportunity to make statements about matters that are dear to our heart, often involves issues in our ridings, sometimes involves issues that we're dealing with in this House. And we're given 1 minute to express our views on those issues. And now I sit here in my seat right next to another member of the House, the member for Charlottetown. I'm a Conservative member of this House. He's a Liberal member of this House. I often disagree with his views. He often disagrees with mine. However, when we are given an opportunity to make member statements, it's a 1-minute opportunity where we typically don't interfere with the ability of the microphones in this House to pick up those comments. Now, yesterday I made a statement in this House, a 1-minute statement, where I praised the fact that the Tackling Violent Crimes Act had been passed, finally. And I expressed my view that it had taken much too long. There had been a lot of delay from the Liberals and the NDP in this House, but finally that act had passed. Now, during my statement, Mr. Speaker, the member for Charlottetown started heckling, and quite frankly, most of us, I know, we heckle in this House from time to time. We do it in a good-natured way. However, yesterday, he leaned over the microphone, which was on at his desk, which is supposed to pick up my voice. He leaned over so far it was almost like he was choking on it, like he was swallowing it. And, Mr. Speaker, no one in this House could hear what I was saying. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, this is broadcast across Canada. And my statement was not heard. Now, Mr. Speaker, there's something even more disconcerting about this member's behavior, the member for Charlottetown. During his comments, as he was leaning over the mic and trying to interfere with my statement, Mr. Speaker, on 5 occasions, in reference to the former Prime Minister, Mr. Mulroney, he said the following words, "Hang Mulroney," 5 times. And on 2 occasions, he said, "Put a noose around his neck." Now, Mr. Speaker, that kind of language is unparliamentary under the best of circumstances. It's a shameful behavior on the part of my colleague in this House, the member for Charlottetown. So I would request that the member offer an unconditional apology for those remarks, as well as an apology for interfering with my statement. I've never leaned over his mic to interfere. I will heckle from time to time, as most of us do, but we do it in a good-natured way. So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask that you review the audio and the videotapes of yesterday's proceedings during question period, and then determine whether an apology is warranted. I certainly believe it does, and it was clearly a shameful behavior on the part of a member of this House. Thank you.
The chair will be glad to review the tape of the proceedings yesterday. I admit that there was a great deal of yelling when the honourable member was making a statement. I turned and tried to quell the disturbance, but the member for Charlottetown wasn't the only one yelling. There seemed to be quite a number yelling, which is not infrequently the case in this particular corner of the House. The Speaker is well aware that there's a lot of shouting back and forth. So I will examine the tape and come back to the House if necessary and deal with the honourable member's point of order. Tabling of documents. Oh, the Chief Government Whip is rising on this point of order.
Just on the same point of order, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to be very brief. But I think upon review you will see that this went way beyond the usual heckling and noise that you just mentioned in this House. As you correctly state, all members heckle from time to time, and noise does get excessive, and you do your best to try and quell that. In this particular case, though, it really does strike at the very privileges of each member of Parliament to be heard in this place. And that's why this is very important that you do a good job of reviewing this, Mr. Speaker, because we do have members in this House that share desks from time to time, as their placement is, between different parties. And if we're going to allow that type of behavior, then it's going to get indeed even more unruly.
I thank the Chief Government Whip for his assistance in this regard. I know that he's aware of the noise that happens from time to time in various places in this House, and I sometimes have even looked to him for assistance in trying to quell disturbances with his ability to whip members. But I will examine the tape. It's my intention to do exactly that, as I've indicated, and if necessary, as I say, I will be back to the House. The noise was excessive. I quite agree. But I haven't seen the tape of the proceedings. I only saw what I saw sitting here. the honourable member. Is this the same point?
Yes, but very briefly, I just have to take. I have to put my 2 cents in this. I sit on this side of the House, and the member from Charlottetown is my seatmate. But I don't want you to come to any conclusions based on just what happened yesterday, because this is ongoing since we've had members of the Conservative Party on this side of the House. So if you're going to review tapes, I think you're going to have to review tapes since there's been Conservative members sitting on this. So let's just be fair on all sides, Mr. Speaker.
I intend to be fair on all sides, as the Speaker's obligation is to be. Oh, Lord above. The honourable member for Peterborough is rising on this point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I encourage you to do that because the honourable member, I believe he's for Bramley Gore Malton, did make a statement yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and all of the Conservative members, as we always are, were in our seats. And I encourage you to look at that statement, Mr. Speaker, and compare the treatment he got with the treatment that my colleague got, and I think you'll find a big difference in the big disparity between how Conservative members acted and how Liberal members acted.
I could sit and look at tapes for hours, particularly ones that involve members in this corner, because I sit so close I can hear a lot of what's going on in terms of noise, at least even if I can't make out the words. I assure the honourable member that I will review the matter and will get back to the House if necessary. And I think we've heard enough on this point. So, tabling of documents, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, of the standing orders of the House of Commons, I have the pleasure to table in both official languages one treaty entitled Agreement among the Government of Canada, the Government of the United Mexican States, and the Government of the United States of America for cooperation in energy science and technology. An explanatory memorandum is enclosed with the treaty. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Statements by ministers. Reports from interparliamentary delegations. Presenting reports from committees. The Honourable Member for Interlake, Selkirk Interlake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to present in both official languages the third report of the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food in relation to Growing Forward, titled The Non-Business Risk Management Programs under Growing Forward. Thank you.
Rapport de délégation
Reports from interparliamentary delegations.
No, report for committees.
I call for reports for interparliamentary delegations. Now I call for reports from committees. The Honourable Member for Mississauga South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to present in both official languages the third report of the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, which met on February 28, 2008, in relation to the Mulroney Airbus settlement study and agreed to the following recommendation. As your committee has now completed its examination of witnesses in this matter, it recommends, as it did in its second report to the House, that the government immediately initiate a formal public inquiry into the Mulroney-Schreiber affair. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Introduction of private members' bills. Mr. Silva and Monsieur Perron.
Mr. Perron.
Mr. Silva. Mr. Silva, seconded by Ms. Guarnieri, moves for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Food and Drugs Act, Food Obtained from Cloned Animals. The motion is deemed adopted. The Honourable Member for Davenport.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm honoured to present my private member's bill, An Act to Amend the Food and Drug Act, Food Obtained from Cloned Animals, to this House. The purpose of this bill is to ban the sale and importation of food obtained from cloned animals. The sale and consumption of cloned meat raise a number of ethical, safety, and animal cruelty issues. Parliament has an obligation to weigh these issues carefully, and this bill intends to force this discussion before the sale of cloned meat and milk becomes an irresistible fact in Canada. According to a 2006 survey, 64% of consumers are uncomfortable with the idea of food from cloned animals. Furthermore, at a time when consumers are rightly demanding the labeling of genetically modified foods, the least we can do is to ensure that we don't slide further down the slippery slope. I ask all members to support this bill and look forward for a fulsome debate on this topic. Thank you.
Mr. Silva, seconded by Ms. Guarnieri, moves that the bill be now read a first time and be printed. This motion is deemed adopted.
First reading of this bill, première lecture de ce projet de loi.
When shall the bill be read a second time? At the next sitting of the House. Monsieur Perron.
Mr. Perron, seconded by Ms. Picard, moves for leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend the Food and Drugs Act, Mandatory Labeling for Genetically Modified Foods. This motion is deemed adopted. The Honourable Member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's with pleasure that I table this bill that you've just named. The purpose of this bill is not to have a trial on genetically modified foods, but rather to enable consumers to make an enlightened choice regarding their nutrition. This bill has been very dear to the heart of the Bloc Québécois for a long time, since my colleague, the member for Drummondville, when she first came to the House, was interested in genetically modified organisms. I hope it gets the support of all members. Thank you. Mr. Perron, seconded by Ms. Picard, moves that the bill be now read a first time and be printed. This motion is deemed adopted. When shall the bill be read a second time?
À la prochaine.
At the next sitting of the House.
First reading of Senate public bills. Motions? Presenting petitions. Présentation de pétitions.
Presenting petitions. The Honourable Member for Gatineau. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm tabling today a petition containing 869 signatures. These Quebecers support Bill C-482. They demand that the federal government respect the Quebec nation and Bill 101 in a concrete manner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Vegreville-Wainwright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to present a petition on behalf of many constituents calling for the unborn child, or noting because the unborn child is not respected when it comes to violent crimes, and they point to the case of Olivia Talbot of Edmonton, who was shot and killed in November 2005. Her 27-week unborn son, Lane Jr., also died, but because there's no legal protection under the law, no charge was laid. The petitioners call on that to be changed, Mr. Speaker, so there be a separate charge laid when the unborn child is a victim of a crime, when a violent crime is committed against the mother.
The Honourable Member for Davenport.
Mr. Speaker, I have with me a petition bringing to light an issue of great concern to the health of Canada's economy. Canada is currently facing a crisis in the manufacturing sector. Every year, thousands of Canadians who work in manufacturing are losing their jobs, and every week more and more manufacturing companies are shutting their doors. The manufacturing sector is vital to engine the Canadian economy, and the loss of these jobs and closing of these companies is going to have a negative impact on Canada's future economic prosperity. I urge Parliament to join with me and petitioners and develop and implement a plan of action to protect Canada's manufacturing jobs and to protect our economic future.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the President of the Treasury Board.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise to present a petition on behalf of constituents principally emanating from the Barrhaven Legion, led by the very distinguished community leader, David Palmer. They are seeking that the Government of Canada, through the Governor-General, institute a volunteer service medal for volunteer service by Canadians in the regular and reserve military forces and cadet corps support staff who were not eligible for the medals that were brought in for specified periods between 1939 and 47 and 1950 and 54. This new service medal would honor Canadians who would otherwise have qualified for those medals but did not serve during the time period when the medal existed. I think that it's a very good idea. You'll be hearing a lot more of it from myself and from Mr. Palmer as we raise this on the national stage in the House of Commons. Secondly, I have a petition from constituents seeking a national strategy to combat suicide. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Présentation de pétition.
Presenting petitions, the Honourable Member for Saint-Bruno, Saint-Lambert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have the honour to table a petition with 100 signatures with respect to a block bill asking the government to respect Bill 101 in Quebec. These signatures come from unions across Quebec stating that in the Canadian Labour Court there is an omission for those workers in federal institutions. This is an omission of the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Edmonton-Sherwood Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have once again a whole handful of petitions that are being signed by people right across the country in support of Bill C-484, the Unborn Victims of Crime Act. I really appreciate the people, Mr. Speaker, who are doing this. I'd like to mention a few towns. We have many, of course, from the major cities, but how about Pembroke, Saskatchewan, Kelowna, Chilliwack, Abbotsford, Regina, and Pembroke? All of these come from right across the country, and they're supporting legislation that would recognize that there would be a separate charge laid when an unborn child dies or is injured when its mother is the victim of a crime. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Presentation of petitions. Présentation de pétition. Questions on the order paper. The Honourable the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indian Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask that all questions be allowed to stand.
Agreed? So ordered. Orders of the day.
Business of Supply, resuming consideration of an opposition motion concerning the public inquiry into the Mulroney-Schreiber affair.
When we last dealt with this issue, there was 5 minutes left in questions and comments for the Honourable Member for Peterborough. Questions and comments? Okay. L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Saint-Bruno, Saint-Lambert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, I would like to ask the member several questions. This member from Peterborough, who gave his speech before question period, with respect to the Mulroney-Schreiber Airbus case. I asked the Prime Minister a question earlier, and the Parliamentary Secretary answered. I asked a question to the member for South Surrey about the time when the Prime Minister was going to instigate an inquiry, and I was told the Prime Minister said back in January, and I quote, after examining the report and consulting Mr. Johnson, the government will set up a public commission of inquiry as soon as the Standing Committee on Access to Information and Ethics has completed its hearings. He didn't say work. He didn't say report. He said hearings. Our hearings were completed last Tuesday. So why is this government and Mr. Del Maestro, who announced earlier, the member for Peterborough said that he's waiting for the report, but that won't be ready for another 2 weeks. Is there another reason? Is there any other type of reason why we're not going ahead with this commission of inquiry? Is the government hoping to conceal things and not go ahead with this commission of inquiry by waiting and stalling?
Well, absolutely not, Mr. Speaker. In fact, what I'd like to know is why this member feels that we've went through all these hearings and conducted these studies, But in fact, she's now essentially indicating that these shouldn't form any basis of the public inquiry. But Professor Johnson, an eminent Canadian, appointed a nonpartisan eminent Canadian, specifically wants to take a look at our findings so that he can frame the ultimate terms of reference of a public inquiry into this matter. As I said in my speech, Mr. Speaker, this is an old story. I don't understand what the rush is. Let's do it right.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The honourable member for Abbotsford.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague, my Conservative colleague, for intervening on this very, very important subject. Just to review, Mr. Speaker, the motion before us today is the motion from the Liberal member for West Nova, who's a member of the Ethics Committee, as is my colleague. And, Mr. Speaker, the problem, of course, is that the motion wants the public inquiry into the Mulroney-Schreiber affair to move forward before there's a final report from the Ethics Committee. It was the understanding of most in this House and most Canadians that, in fact, Professor Johnson had recommended that a final report be delivered before an inquiry moved forward. Now, Mr. Speaker, my question to my colleague, my Conservative colleague, is this. He knows that the member for West Nova today in this House made a startling accusation, which I don't believe is true, but he made the accusation that somehow our Conservative government is somehow implicated in that affair, the Schreiber affair. And yet I haven't seen any evidence to that effect. And since the honourable member for Peterborough actually participated in the committee hearings at the Ethics Committee, he's probably in the best position to advise this House whether, in fact, there was any evidence to show that the current government was implicated in that Schreiber affair.
The honourable member for Peterborough won't be surprised to learn that he has less than a minute to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, no, what the committee heard was exactly the opposite. There's absolutely no evidence whatsoever. In fact, every single witness came forward and said this has absolutely nothing to do with the current government or any member of the current government. They also came forward, every single witness came forward and said they had absolutely no evidence of criminal wrongdoing on the part of any public office holder at all. You know, the only unethical behavior that's occurred, in my personal opinion, is the unethical behavior of the member from West Nova, who has been attending dinners with Mr. Karl-Heinz Schreiber, according to Mr. Schreiber, dating all the way back to August, which is well in advance I agree with that. Well in advance of a statement made by Mr. Karl-Heinz Schreiber in court and sworn testimony that is contradictory to statements he's made before. But then again, just about everything Mr. Schreiber said.
L'honorable député de...
The honourable member for Saint-Bruno Saint-Lambert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to express my opinion on the Mulroney-Schreiber incident. The member for West Nova provided an excellent summary of the whole Airbus-Schreiber-Mulroney case. But what concerns us here is a former parliamentarian, and that's what was also of concern to the Ethics Committee, which and here I refer to the hearings held by the Access to Information and Ethics Committee. The Ethics Committee focused on the Mulroney Airbus incident, and what we're really concerned with respect to Mr. Mulroney. He's a former Prime Minister, a former parliamentarian, and his behavior, his activities concerned us. First of all, I would say we were concerned by this, and after what we heard, we were very, very worried. For all of these reasons, as you heard a few moments ago, this is why the committee asked the Prime Minister to begin his commission of inquiry immediately in order to shed some light on this whole issue. The member for West Nova provided a very good summary of what happened from back in 1984, what happened during the 1990s. It's a very complicated story, and I wouldn't say necessarily that it wasn't really all that clear, because it was a very convoluted, complicated story, very difficult to follow. The member gave a very good summary of what happened, and there were a secret trial, And all these books that were written in English about the Airbus matter were never translated into French, as far as I know. They shed light on certain portions of what happened ever since Airbus decided to invade the North American market. This is why we are calling for a commission of inquiry. This is why we want it to be done as quickly as possible. Moreover, the Prime Minister, on January 11, 2008, the Prime Minister, the Honourable Member for Saint-Bruno-Saint-Lambert, will sit down for 1 second, please. This is the second time in 10 minutes that she names a member in this House, and I hope this will be the last time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the first and last time ever since I've been elected that this has occurred. I apologize. Yes, I hope this will be the last time. So the Prime Minister promised us on January 11th that he would start the Commission of Inquiry once the hearings were over. We believed him. But now that the hearings are over, he's pushed it off to another 2 weeks. And now we're wondering what other reasons are involved. Is it because this Conservative government is trying to find any kind of measure, a tactic to push back the holding of a Commission of Inquiry, which will enable us to understand what happened under the previous Conservative government? Our committee did very good work. All members of the committee did his or her job. We did it in a different way, of course, but we did it within the parameters of a parliamentary committee. Some people were disappointed. Some people were disappointed, but this wasn't a commission of inquiry. This was a parliamentary committee, a political committee, with members of parliament sitting around a table who asked questions in good faith in order to have some clarification, and this was a very difficult task. We believe that the work of this committee is, well, we know that the committee work is done now. It's done its job. We had certain limitations, and now we will have a commission of inquiry that will have a much broader mandate, and I'll explain. First of all, there were many contradictions, which justifies why we need to have a commission of inquiry. Nobody believes that the former Prime Minister who said that he wouldn't sell arms to China, well, he simply overnight just talks about having a contract with China. He was unable to point out what he had done to earn this $300,000, and the people that worked on the Bearhead Schreiber project, Mr. Alford, Mr. Marc Lalonde, they don't recall having seen Brian Mulroney work on this project. Nobody confirmed this. So not only can people not confirm that Mr. Mulroney had worked on this on the Canadian scene, as Mr. Schreiber purports, but even internationally, there's nobody alive who recalls that Mr. Mulroney actually had, in fact, fulfilled his obligations with respect to this incident. So this is a very, very troubling issue. Some people say that there is no reason to call a commission of inquiry, but there's too many contradictions, there's too much incongruity, there are too many improbabilities, and this leads to a lot of doubt. And even it's true that 1,000 suspicions do not constitute evidence, but we do wonder whether potential criminal acts were committed, and this was done in the past, and we set up the Gomery Commission. We want all of the witnesses to testify under oath. The former Conservative Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, testified under oath. Some people are saying that this is not a matter of concern for the public. Well, the Canadian taxpayers, Quebec taxpayers, paid $25 million in commissions. through their taxes, because Airbus, amongst other countries, had the Canadian government pay $25 million in addition in order to include all these costs. And then perhaps if we hadn't had all of these commissions, perhaps the government at that time would have had a different, made a different decision with respect to the purchase of these 34 planes, and maybe it would have cost us less money. Some people are saying but the Conservative Prime Minister received cash, $300,000. And let's remember that it was a Bloc Québécois that raised this whole issue. Why? We felt, and we convinced this House, that these $1,000 bills were associated with mafia and misdemeanors. So that's for this reason that the Bloc Québécois convinced this House to prohibit $1,000 bills, and this was unanimous in the House. The former Prime Minister of Canada received $225,000 or $300,000, we no longer know, money in envelopes. This was received in a brown envelope in a hotel room. No invoice, no receipt, no invoices or no accounting of expenditures, no accountability. Why? And the money was put in a safe. Why didn't he put it in the bank? And we know that he didn't tell the tax department about this until 5 years down the line, when Karl-Heinz Schreiber was arrested for the first time. It's a question of cause and effect. So it's only when Mr. Mulroney saw that Schreiber was having a run-in with justice that he revealed the money that he had received. When somebody receives as much money under the circumstances that I have just explained, when you consider that a businessman received $250,000 for a commission as a result of his work as being a former prime minister, well, when this happens, everybody has to ask questions, and this commission of inquiry must be held, Mr. Speaker. Nobody can corroborate Brian Mulroney's version of the facts. Even his friend, Mr. Doucette, cannot really corroborate. Nobody living, nobody alive can testify that these international meetings took place with respect to Mr. Mulroney. And so in sociology, it says there is a principle that states the sum of a group is always greater, sum is greater than the individual parts. There's another thing as well. Mr. Mulroney said that he had made a mistake, a monumental mistake. He repeated this over and over. A serious error in judgment, according to his words. But why didn't he explain why he made this mistake? And what were his motivations? What was in his head? Why was his judgment so clouded? What were his motivations? What was the objective? Why didn't he have the same reflex as that he had shown in previous incidents? But unfortunately, the Ethics Committee didn't have the time to ask him questions. Perhaps some people feel that nothing was learned at the Ethics Committee, but I'm sorry, that is not at all the case. First and foremost, this information got out to the public. All the information contained in books in English Canada is now becoming known in Quebec, and now Quebecers can find out about this serious and troubling situation.
It's the first time that we heard that there were so many contradictions, because it was the first time that we heard Brian Mulroney's version and not something that was given to us through his spokesman, Luc Lavoie, who only gave us 10 minutes worth here and there and really didn't give all of the information. Luc Lavoie said that he had been Mulroney's spokesman for years, and he was much more aware of very detailed facts. For example, the
code name of Stevie Cameron for the RCMP. He was aware of that, but he didn't remember the facts concerning Brian Mulroney, including the exact amount that he had received. And that's the first time that Brian Mulroney gave his own version of the facts publicly, and it was different from what his spokesman had said. And it's the first time that we learned that there was so much contradiction as to the amount that had been received, as to the agreement itself, and as to the business that had given this contract to Brian Mulroney. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that I learned a great deal. I read all of the books that were written on this matter, and I had an opportunity to question witnesses, and I did this in all good faith, and I learned so many things. I also learned, among other things, that a $90,000 bill and a check for $90,000 had been given to Fred Doucette through Mr. Schreiber only a few weeks after he had left his official duties with this government, and it was only 3 weeks after Airbus had paid $5 million into Mr. Schreiber's account. So if you want to look at the calendar, you can see that what happened was that $5 million in commission is paid into a Swiss account by Airbus for Mr. Schreiber. 3 weeks later, Mr. Doucette gives an invoice for services rendered for $90,000, even though he's only been on the market for 3 weeks, and then he receives a check for $90,000 a few days later. Now, a bill for services rendered, who is worth that much, $90,000 for a few weeks' worth of work for services rendered? What type of services would this be? This is the first time that we heard Brian Mulroney's version, as I said, and now Canadians and Quebecers are entitled to hear him under oath. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions et commentaires?
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Hochelaga. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to wish you a good Friday. And I'd like to thank my colleague for her very serious, assiduous work on the Ethics Committee. And I'd like to tell her that I find it terribly reassuring that we have an Ethics Committee in Parliament. Ethics doesn't involve law. Ethics doesn't involve morality. Ethics involves the behavior, the best behavior that one must exemplify in all circumstances. And I know that my colleague worked very hard. She read all of the documents. She questioned the witnesses. And from time to time, reporters spoke about the questions that she had asked in committee. And we saw on TVA and other networks how relevant her questions were. So I have a few questions I'd like to ask her now so that she can explain something that is somewhat unbelievable. That is, a former prime minister who held the highest post in the land might have accepted contracts during the last days. Even though he was no longer prime minister, he was still a sitting member in the House of Commons. And I'd like our colleague to remind us of when exactly Mr. Mulroney agreed to meet with Mr. Schreiber. There was a code of ethics that existed and applied to all members of the House of Commons at the time. So I'd like to ask my colleague how the former Prime Minister found himself at odds with this code of ethics. And I'd like her to explain the importance of having a parliamentary committee where the representatives of the people, elected members of Parliament, can act as guardians, because we are the guardians of public integrity. It's important that we not simply have a commission, because I believe that the contribution of members of Parliament in this type of matter, even though colleagues have said, well, you don't have the means, you don't have the same access to research as would a commission of inquiry. And of course, a committee shouldn't be a court, but there is still work that can be done. And I'd like the honourable member to tell us what her committee and what she did to shed light on something that has been very troubling in recent times. The honourable member for Saint-Bruno, Saint-Hubert. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for Hochelaga for his question. And this is what I would like to tell him. First of all, with respect to the Code of Ethics. A Code of Ethics, or ethics, exists so that the people will have faith in their elected officials. And elected members should show integrity so that faith will remain and the public will continue to have faith in elected members. And not only must you not do something, but you must not appear to have done something. And there are many parts of the Code of Ethics that applied at the time that continue to apply, and some have even been strengthened. For example, one must not take any personal benefit for oneself or for one's family, benefit accruing from one's everyday work here in the House of Commons, and one must not appear to be gaining any type of benefit. So you have to have integrity and you have to appear to have integrity. That's extremely important. And I'd like to tell you a story. We don't have time, unfortunately, but I would like to illustrate the fact that in the Bloc Québécois we have a great deal of integrity, and we sometimes pay out of our own pockets so as not to appear to be taking something from the public. That said, the committee's contribution was great, and everyone worked very hard, everyone in his or her own way, with his or her own objectives, but everyone wanted to shed light on something that is of concern not only to the committee, but to all Canadians and to all Quebecers. We want to know what really happened. And we think, and this is what the committee concluded, we think that only a public commission of inquiry, with as broad a mandate as possible, will be able to help us to answer all of these questions that remain unanswered, including the main question, that is, where did the Airbus commissions given to Mr. Schreiber end up? 10 million, it is said, was distributed to parliamentarians. That's what we've heard, but no one has been able to trace this money, and we have to do that. Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Moncton Riverview-Dieppe. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was a bit of a tourist at the Ethics Committee, but I very much appreciate the work done by the member, and I have some questions. Unfortunately, we did not have an opportunity to question Mr. Mulroney a second time, but if the Commission does have an opportunity to question Mr. Mulroney, I wonder whether the honourable member would agree with a few of these questions. For example, Mr. Mulroney said nothing to Mr. Luc Lavoie, his official spokesman, about the amount of money that Mr. Mulroney received from Mr. Schreiber. During the Airbus scandal, in the first place, and this is after $500,000 in fees that Mr. Lavoie charged the Canadian public. So why did Mr. Mulroney not tell anything to Mr. Lavoie? And secondly, Mr. Fred Doucette worked for all of 1991. He attended meetings. He spoke with Mr. Mulroney and other members of the Conservative Party to discuss Bearhead. But it's clear, because Norman Spector said so, it was clear that Mr. Mulroney cancelled the project. So why did Mr. Mulroney not say anything to his friend, his longtime friend, Fred Doucette, who goes back to St. FX in Nova Scotia? Why did he say nothing to him in 1990? These are two important questions. It would only take 10 minutes to ask these questions and ask why Mr. Mulroney would not attend the committee meeting. The Honourable Member for Saint-Bruno Saint-Hubert. I'd like to thank my colleague for his question, or his two questions, and they're excellent. And this is among a number of questions that we had that we were not able to ask because of the very restricted and limited format that applies during a parliamentary committee. We might have been able to do it within another context, but at committee we didn't have enough time to put all of the questions we wanted to ask and hear all of the answers that we wanted to hear. So not only was it very frustrating, but very difficult for us to understand what was happening and for us to have a real answer on some of these issues. And that's why we need a commission of inquiry, because the commission will have research services available, will have the expertise for putting questions and interrogating and cross-examination. We weren't able to ask all of these questions, although we did ask some, and his questions are excellent. Why was Luc Lavoie himself so curious about Airbus when he spoke in public, but not curious when he spoke with Brian Mulroney, with whom he'd worked for years, and whom he was supposed to represent as spokesman? When you are a public spokesman for someone, it seems to me that you have to know who you are representing. And when you are answering questions from reporters on behalf of someone else, you should have all of the facts at your fingertips so as to be able to answer questions. But Luc Lavoie is a professional in communications. He's an expert in communications. Unfortunately, well, a public inquiry will have to ask him those questions, as well as the other question about the fact that Mr. Mulroney didn't tell his friends, Fred Doucette and others, that the Bearhead Project was dead. Before recognizing the member for Winnipeg Centre, I'd like to thank the honourable member for Saint-Hubert, Saint-Bruno Saint-Hubert, for her graciousness in accepting my comments earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to serve notice at the beginning of my speech that I'd like to share my time with the member from Windsor-Tecumseh. Mr. Speaker, as the Vice Chair of the Ethics Committee, I have just spent the last 3 months totally immersed in a very dark and troubling period of Canadian history. Mr. Speaker, it seems that there was a time when this great country was hijacked by some very bad people, people who would abuse the power of their office for their own self-interest and benefit, people who would break faith with the Canadian people by abusing the checks and balances and rules that we put in place to preclude such a thing from ever happening. We've been studying an era of Canadian politics, Mr. Speaker, where corporate lobbyists were running roughshod over everything that's good and decent about Canadian politics and our democratic institutions. We've been studying an era where corrupt politicians abuse the power of their office to line their own pockets. We've been researching, Mr. Speaker, a period of history where there were 5% minimum kickbacks, mandatory, on public works projects. These are facts, Mr. Speaker. These are not theories that our committee is. And some of these people, some of these corrupt politicians were caught and tried and convicted in subsequent years. Some continue to enjoy the spoils of their malfeasance and their abuse of our system, Mr. Speaker. Some of the key actors, in fact, of this era continue to operate unmolested in exactly the same way today. That might be one of the most disturbing things that we realized as members of our committee, Mr. Speaker. Some of the very key actors in this, the darkest period of Canadian history, recent history, are continuing to operate in the same modus operandi that so offended the sensibilities of Canadians at the time and in subsequent generations. Mr. Speaker, the question as to whether or not there was political interference in the Airbus purchase for Air Canada has taken us on a long, circuitous journey, a journey where we learned of a parcel of rogues perhaps unparalleled in Canadian history. We have been witnessing the dark underbelly of Ottawa, Mr. Speaker, someplace that I never care to go again, someplace, frankly, that nauseates me as a Canadian, as it would offend the sensibilities of all good people in this country who expect better from their public office holders. Our research began really, Mr. Speaker, and took us back to a disturbing period in Canadian history where foreign money actually undertook a coup, a silent coup in Canada. Franz Joseph Strauss, Premier of Bavaria, a man who the media in his own country calls an unrepentant Nazi, also was the CEO of Airbus, rigged the 1983 Conservative Convention to unseat Joe Clark, and 6 months later put in place Brian Mulroney. Mr. Speaker, that alone should have been enough to horrify Canadians. They should have taken to the rooftops to scream their derision over this political interference by foreign powers, an unrepentant Nazi from a foreign country running roughshod over our democratic process in this Canada. Mr. Speaker, this was orchestrated by the team that put Brian Mulroney in place. The Walter Wolfs, the Karl-Heinz Schreibers, the Frank Moores, the Gary Willett, the Doucette brothers. And yet Brian Mulroney claims that he has absolutely nothing to do with the purchase of the Airbus purchase, but yet as soon as he was in power, put in place by this dirty money from an unrepentant Nazi, one of the first things he did was fire 13 of the 15 members of the board of directors of Air Canada and put in place 13 Conservative allies, one of whom was Frank Moores, the chief lobbyist for Airbus, onto the board of directors of Air Canada. And we also took note, Mr. Speaker, that the CEO of Air Canada at the time, Pierre Junot, where do you think he retired to? As soon as the Airbus purchase was officially announced in 1988, Mr. Junot retires to Toulouse, France, home of Airbus. Odd choice, coincidence, I suppose. But, Mr. Speaker, these are the things that we've been dealing with. That's where the story started. We now moved on, Mr. Speaker, to the issue of the $2.1 million that Canada paid out in the defamation lawsuit that Brian Mulroney filed against the Government of Canada. Brian Mulroney filed a lawsuit for $50 million to sue the people of Canada because they implied that he took money from Karl-Heinz Schreiber. We now know that he did take money from Karl-Heinz Schreiber in the most shady of circumstances, this phantom lobbying that he claims he earned the $300,000. He admits it was a mistake, but now he would have us believe he earned that money legitimately. Let me say at the outset, Mr. Speaker, of this particular section, no amount of bafflegab is ever going to take the stink off of the image that is tattooed, that is emblazoned on people's minds of a former Prime Minister of Canada taking sacks full of cash from an arms dealer in a secret hotel room meetings. We could have studies for years and explanations by hired mouthpieces on behalf of Brian Mulroney for years. Nobody will ever forget that image, and we are horrified even as we speak of it today. The reason I say phantom lobbying is because the very company that he says he was lobbying for, ThyssenKrupp, the arms of Krupp, we've all read our history books of the Second World War. These are the guys that armed the Nazis. They're now one of the largest companies in the world in terms of arms dealers. The arms of Krupp and Thyssen didn't know that Brian Mulroney was on their payroll. How can you be lobbying for such a huge international corporation, and how could a huge corporation like that not know that a former head of state of a G7 nation was on their payroll? It defies credulity, Mr. Speaker, and we simply, some of us on the committee, simply cannot accept that without some more proof. And we asked Mr. Mulroney to please present some documentation to attest or to prove that he in fact did meet with the leaders of China, Russia, and France to earn the $300,000 that he was given. Some of us think that's awfully rich compensation for 3 brief meetings with 3 heads of state, but it also begs the question, why would you be trying to sell tanks to China right after Tiananmen Square when he himself was so outraged, and we did have international agreements to not arm those communist countries at that time. The story simply begs for further investigation and validation. Our committee, Mr. Speaker, was wrestling with a number of issues that time does not permit me to go through, but let me now say that as of 12:10 today, I see I'm running out of time, the chairman of our committee introduced the 3rd report of the Standing Committee on Ethics, which clearly stated that the work of our committee is now concluded. We are not hearing any more witnesses. I'm proud of the work that our committee did. I would be happy to debate any of the armchair quarterbacks who have criticized the work that we did, mostly Conservative Party members in the country who don't like this era of Canadian history being dredged up. We, in fact, did a great deal in a short period of time at no cost to the taxpayers, because I remind colleagues here, our committee meets every Tuesday and Thursday, whether we have Brian Mulroney as our witness or anybody else. It was no cost to the taxpayer, and we moved the puck down the ice a great deal in this struggle to shed some light on this dark era. It's now time to pass the puck to those best able to put it in the net. And that means the public inquiry should begin without delay. And this is the subject of the Opposition Day motion we're debating today. The Liberals are trying to change the channel from the humiliation of having to vote in favour of the Conservative budget, so they want us to talk about Schreiber-Mulroney. Fine, we'll have this opportunity. The Prime Minister of Canada and the Justice Minister have both stood in their place, promising Canadians there would be a full public inquiry. He said, let's wait until the Ethics Committee finishes hearing witnesses. We are finished. We're concluded. All we want to do is go home and take a shower and pretend it never happened, some of us. But we now are passing the files, we're passing the baton over to the public inquiry. It should be implemented and begun without delay. We understand it takes some time to set up a full public inquiry. That process should begin today. And I thank you for the opportunity to join in the debate today, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Etobicoke North.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the member from Winnipeg Centre. And I look forward as well to a public inquiry. I'm not sure the public inquiry will be scoped out broadly enough to include an examination of the money that went missing from Airbus to some people or individuals. I wish it would, because it's clear that some money changed hands. And I know it's a bit inappropriate to mention names, but I've always been intrigued by the notion that perhaps the role that might have been played by Lucien Bouchard, and I think an inquiry would clear the air if he was not involved at all. But of course, at the time of the Airbus transaction, Mr. Bouchard was the ambassador for Canada in France. And it would be no secret that, well, it's no secret that Airbus is a consortium which involves France, and it would probably be no secret to conclude that Mr. Bouchard may have felt stronger allegiances to France than to Canada, because, of course, as a separatist, he doesn't have too many allegiances to this country. In fact, he became leader of the Parti Québécois sometime later. But I've always been curious. I know that Airbus at that time was very, very anxious to establish a presence in the North American airplane market, especially the passenger market. They didn't have any presence there. Their competition, of course, was Boeing, and they were desperate to get a leg hold of the North American market. And this is probably, if money did change hands, why it did, to try to do that. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, I know that Air Canada had a very rigorous evaluation of the bids. There was a group that evaluated the bids from Boeing and Airbus along a number of different lines: operational efficiency, capacity, fuel economy, price, etc. And I do know that Airbus really sharpened their pencils. They had a very good bid proposal. I know that for a fact, and well, I don't know for a fact, but I'm quite confident of that fact. And they did that because they wanted to penetrate the North American passenger airplane market. So it's conceivable that they had a good bid. But I think the point about the board of directors, I personally believe that Prime Minister Mulroney probably didn't receive much directly in terms of the money from the Karl-Heinz Schreibers of the world. But a lot of these other people, I believe, did get some money. And sometimes I think it's a question of showing the influence that you can bring. But I can't, in my wildest dreams, Mr. Speaker, imagine the former Prime Minister picking up the phone to the chairman of Air Canada and saying, you know, we really got to do this with Airbus. I mean, it goes beyond the realm of possibility in my mind. But I'll close that, Mr. Speaker, by asking the member from Winnipeg Centre touched on the question of the appointment of board directors, sympathetic to Mr. Mulroney and other aspects. And I wonder if you could comment on whether he believes Mr. Lucien Bouchard may have been involved.
The honourable member for Etobicoke North consumed more than 3 minutes, so there's less than 2 minutes for the reply.
Well, I do appreciate the question, and I appreciate the fleshing out of some of the details of my colleague, who was very knowledgeable about the Airbus sale added to the debate. Let me simply say the name of Mr. Bouchard has come up a number of times in our study, in our inquiry. We believe we don't know the extent of his involvement, but I, too, would be very interested to learn what influence he may have exerted as the ambassador to France. I have no doubt he was involved or included in this process in some way. But where the money went, we didn't have time in my speech to deal with it, but there was millions of dollars of grease money. This is not unusual for European companies at the time to realize that in order to grease the wheels of commerce for a sale of that size, they have to sprinkle some money around. In this case, it was $20 million, about $10 million on the European side and $10 million in the Canadian side. We don't know who the beneficiaries were of that grease money. We have a better idea where the commissions went. They went to Frank Moores and GCI. Some have alleged that GCI was a lobby firm set up by Brian Mulroney's closest associates to act as a piggy bank, to hold the loot until such time as the smoke cleared and the beneficiaries could avail themselves of the loot. There were foreign bank accounts. It's extremely complex, and this is why a public inquiry may be able to put the puck in the net where we could only move the puck down the ice. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Windsor-Tecumseh should perhaps note that he'll be interrupted at 1:15. The honourable member for Windsor-Tecumseh has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you for the pointing out the time constraint, but I think I'll get most of my 10 minutes in, and I'll also be able to avoid questions. Not that I wouldn't expect one or two intelligence ones from this House, but that may be a fond hope. In any event, Mr. Speaker, I think my opening comments are to be somewhat critical of this motion coming forward at this time. As you look at it and look at the other issues that are confronting us in this Parliament right now, the budget and debate around that in particular, and you can't help but wonder about the motivation of the Liberals, since they obviously don't want to be confronted with their flexibility on the budget and their unwillingness to stand up, as they should, as the formal official opposition, and challenge the government on a great deal of this budget, but rather sit on their hands, as they have so often in these last 6 months, and not play the role that they probably should, and not protect the Canadian people from the kind of budget that we have. And instead, they move on this. And I don't want to downplay in any way or demean the significance of the Mulroney-Schreiber, the Airbus, that inquiry and the need for it. But that message has been clearly sent out by the Ethics Committee, by a great deal of the positions of all political parties except for the Conservatives, and by the Canadian public generally. And that really this debate today, I would suggest, is really not necessary, because all of the points that have been made that I've heard so far today have been made repeatedly in the past. And so the political pressure is on the House, and more specifically on this government, to get the public inquiry going as quickly as possible. You know, and it's interesting, Mr. Speaker, it's quite obvious that the government is very interested in prolonging the establishment of the public inquiry until the next election occurs, and have the election done and over with before the public inquiry gets started, and certainly before it completes its work. Mr. Speaker, in that regard, I think the crucial issue here is not only to get the inquiry going, but the mandate that that inquiry is given. Because if it follows what we are very clearly, I think, being messaged from the government at the present time, and to some degree the recommendations that came from Dr. Johnson, is that this will be a very limited mandate. It basically won't do anything. I would argue strongly that if we see that limited mandate, that is intentional, that result is intentional, that it won't do anything. We'll spend a chunk of money on it, we'll put a lot of resources into it for a very limited mandate, and we will come to no conclusions. Mr. Speaker, I want to acknowledge the work that my colleague from Winnipeg has done on the committee, and that the work of the committee generally of moving this forward. We also have to recognize the limitations that they were functioning under, the lack of financial resources, lack of professional resources. I think in particular the lack of forensic accounting resources that would have allowed them to move it even further along. And Mr. Speaker, this has been a bit of a, a rather significant problem for me as I analyze how Parliament functions and how our committees function, as opposed to the way committees function in other parliaments around the globe. And, Mr. Speaker, both this government and the prior Liberal government, and we saw it with the sponsorship scandal there, that we do not provide sufficient resources in our structure within this House and within the committee structure is not flexible enough, is not well-resourced enough to be able to do the job that we are required to do or expected to do when we are faced with this kind of an issue, these kind of facts. And I address it specifically as a situation where we, as a committee, are expected to conduct a quasi-inquiry without having anywhere near the resources. And again, we saw that very clearly. I can remember speaking at that time to the chairman of the Public Accounts Committee during the sponsorship scandal and saying to him, look, this is everything that we've got. He was an accountant himself, Mr. Speaker, and saying to him, there's no way that you're going to be able to get to the bottom of this. And we saw that was the case. And again, that committee did excellent work. But because of the limitations of resources, it really took the Gomery inquiry to get us much further along that line. And we saw the same thing here. Excellent work, as I saw it, by the Ethics Committee as far as they could go. But you saw with Mr. Mulroney his refusal to give documentation to back up what was a fairly incredible story, but to back it up. The one that really got me, Mr. Speaker, was when he claimed that his income tax returns were sacred. Mr. Speaker, my wife's relationship with me is sacred. My relationship with my children is sacred. But I want to be very clear to this House that my relationship with my accountant and the Revenue Canada office is not sacred, and neither should Mr. Mulroney's. But that's the kind of what we were up against, and not having adequate resources to really challenge that. That's why we need the inquiry to get up, established as quickly as possible, follow the report that was tabled today, say to the Prime Minister, you have to do it now, and you have to make it with a mandate that is broad enough to get at all of the issues and to finally put this to bed for all Canadian citizens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It being 1:15 p.m., it is my duty to interrupt the proceedings and put forthwith every question necessary to dispose of the business of supply. La question est la suivante.
Question is as follows. Mr. Thibault, West Nova, seconded by Mr. Kusner, moves that in the opinion of the House, the government should end its delays and immediately commence the public inquiry into the Mulrooney-Schreiber affair.
Pleasure of the House to adopt the motion.
All those in favor of the motion will please say yea.
All those opposed will please say nay. In my opinion, the nays have it. Conformément à l'article
Pursuant to Standing Order 45, the division stands deferred until Monday, March 3rd, 2008, at the ordinary hour of daily adjournment.
Orders of the day. The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake is rising on a point of order.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, I ask that you see the clock at 1:30.
Agreed? Agreed. Orders of the day.
Private members' business, resuming debate at second reading of Bill C-394, an act to amend the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, sponsorship of
The Honourable the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Indian Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak to Bill C-394, an act to amend Canada's Immigration and Refugee Protection Act by allowing for the once-in-a-lifetime sponsorship of a relative. As all members have heard, this bill before the House is not new. Governments and stakeholders have debated and analyzed for several years whether such a provision would be workable. All of us believe in the principle of reuniting families. That is not an issue. The list of those who can be sponsored from abroad is already quite extensive, Mr. Speaker, and contrary to the assertion made previously by the member from Parkdale High Park, this is a point I will return to later. Currently, those who can be sponsored include spouses, common law and conjugal partners, parents, grandparents, dependent children, including those who are adopted, as well as orphaned brothers, sisters, nephews, nieces, or grandchildren who are under the age of 18 years old. But the one-time sponsorship option, such as that proposed in Bill C-394, is fundamentally flawed because it is an expansion of the family class, which would be unsustainable and unmanageable. Bill C-394 would define an eligible relative to include a brother or sister, an aunt or an uncle, a niece or a nephew, and so on. Past experiences that, even with more resources, such an open-ended system would generate an increase in the backlog and processing times for this and other categories of immigrants, and would seriously undermine the integrity and credibility of the whole immigration program. Responsible members will also recognize that such an expansion of the family class would create additional problems for our immigration program. As it is, our officers are already pouring significant time and effort into the family relation verification process. Understandably, we must ensure that family members and relatives are who they say they are. Expanding the family class in the way this bill proposes would make the family relation verification process extremely difficult, if not impossible. Mr. Speaker, provisions already exist to process applications from relatives who are not immediate family members in certain circumstances. There is little reason to duplicate this in a separate piece of legislation with such serious problems. If Canadians and permanent residents have no close family members in Canada and none abroad whom they can sponsor a more distant relative, regardless of their age or relationship. Section 117(1)H of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations defines a foreign national as a member of the family class with respect to a sponsor if they are a relative of the sponsor, regardless of their age, and if the sponsor does not have a spouse, common law partner, or conjugal partner, or any other immediate family member in Canada or abroad. In addition, Section 25 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act itself can be used to permit the sponsorship of a foreign national relative who would not otherwise qualify as a member of the family class if exceptional humanitarian and compassionate grounds exist. Furthermore, foreign nationals who apply as skilled workers and who have close family members in Canada are given the advantage of 5 additional points on the selection grid. As well, Mr. Speaker, regulations already exist to make it much easier for Canadians and permanent residents to sponsor their loved ones from abroad and expand the family class in a well-managed and sustainable way. Mr. Speaker, our system for sponsoring family members is one of the most flexible in the world. Canada allows citizens as well as permanent residents equal opportunity to sponsor members of their family. This is different from countries such as the United States, which restricts some sponsorship privileges only to citizens. Canada is also different from some other countries in that we do not apply economic selection criteria to family class members. Far from being too restrictive, Mr. Speaker, Canada's family class program is expansive in a balanced and well-managed way. Today we include spouses, common law and conjugal partners, dependent children, as well as orphaned siblings, nieces, nephews, and grandchildren. Canadians and permanent residents can also sponsor their grandparents. If a citizen or permanent resident has none of these close relatives, that person may sponsor any other relative who would not otherwise be eligible for sponsorship from abroad. In exceptional cases, Mr. Speaker, certain requirements of the family class can be waived on humanitarian and compassionate grounds to allow individuals to sponsor their loved ones who otherwise wouldn't qualify. Countries such as the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom include different and various combinations of individuals in their respective definitions of family class members. But none of those 4 follow the wide-open example of the private members bill before us today, which could greatly increase the potential for fraud and abuse, in addition to having an incalculable impact on the backlog and processing times. All impose controls on intake through their either selection criteria or more restrictive definitions of who may be considered a family member. The model Canada has chosen, therefore, compares favorably on the world stage. The family class has already been expanded in a well-planned and responsible way, Mr. Speaker. Provisions already exist for individuals who wish to sponsor an individual not included in the family class without jeopardizing the integrity of the immigration program itself. Once again, I must repeat that such a potentially wide-open approach would have a huge impact on our processing capacity and would significantly increase the already large backlog our government inherited from the previous government. That said, Mr. Speaker, I would note that the previous Liberal government did express clear opposition to this legislation when it came up for debate in the previous versions of the bill. Our colleagues in the Liberal Party have also expressed misgivings about this bill more recently, during the first hour of debate. The former Liberal Parliamentary Secretary, the current member for Vancouver, said on February 12, 2004, that the actual effect of this legislation would be, and I quote, "If this proposal is adopted, not only will we see significant resources to deal with a large number of cases, but we will also need proportionally more resources to deal with the family class applications, simply to maintain the existing ratio between family and economic class immigration." She continued on to say, and I quote, "The changes proposed run counter to the principles of fairness, balance, and consultation, so we cannot support it." More recently, in the first hour of debate on this bill, the Liberal immigration critic and member for Vaughan said, and I quote, "The bill essentially could create an exponential influx of immigration applicants that could result in delays in processing priority members of the family class that are spouses, partners, and dependent children." Mr. Speaker, these are the words of the opposition in this legislature, and they're not our own, but they do they're worth repeating. Mr. Speaker, they are positions that have been expressed by the Liberal Party, both when they were in government and in opposition, and they're positions that they still hold. I hope that the Liberal Party will do the responsible thing and oppose this legislation, as they did a short time ago while they were in government. Mr. Speaker, before I close, I have to say that I find the NDP position on the immigration backlog astounding. As the NDP have already indicated, they will be voting against our measures in Budget 2008 that will help reduce the immigration backlog. And not only are they going to vote against measures to reduce the backlog, Mr. Speaker, but through Bill C-394, they are actively working to exponentially increase that backlog. That is what this bill does, Mr. Speaker. I cannot stand for that, and I encourage my colleagues in the House not to stand for it either. I cannot support the concept of a once-in-a-lifetime sponsorships and will vote against this fundamentally flawed scheme set out in Bill C-394. I hope that all honourable members will join me in this. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Scarborough, Rouge River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Bill C-394, Private Members Bill, is not a new initiative. It's a repeat of several previous initiatives of private members to put forward amendments to the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act that would change the definition of family class so that it would expand it to allow a greater number of people in the relative class to be viewed as family class. And taken in isolation, it might be seen as somewhat benign, not a complex piece, and certainly, as I'll mention later, the proposal in concept has been received favorably among immigration quarters, immigration groups, settlement groups, and one can understand why they might see this as a positive change, but I'll address some of those issues later in relation to immigration settlement. We in the Liberal Party, we know that immigration is a fundamental component, a critical and fundamental component of Canada's future growth and prosperity. Without a healthy immigration program, our country, our children's country, may fail to achieve many of the very promising objectives that we see out there in the future, both economically and sociologically. And we see that immigration hasn't just built the country to where it is now. It is actually fundamental in taking us from the present into the future as a strong and independent economy with the necessary skills and connection to the rest of the world. We are a trading nation, and we see that immigration is a factor in how we will maintain and improve our trade relationships around the world. Mr. Speaker, the current immigration intake in Canada is approximately 300,000 persons per year, just slightly under that. And I'll just use the 300,000 round number. Within that number, there are included what we call the economic class. That would be the skilled workers, investors, other persons in those categories. Then there's the family class, where the criteria applied, aside from the normal criteria involving health and criminal record checks, those criteria simply involve the relationship between the Canadian who sponsors and the family member who has applied. And that category of immigration has served us well. It's continuing to do it. And then there's the refugee class, a small component of the 300,000, but in the vicinity of 15 to 25,000 persons each year. All of that coming together, we have a fairly decent immigration flow. The one point I would make in understanding this, Mr. Speaker, is that between the family class and the economic class, based on a policy decision, those numbers are split between 60% of being economic class, 40% being family class. And it used to be in the range of 50-50, but there was a decision taken at about the time of the adoption of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act based on the advice of the Standing Committee and other stakeholders that 60% of our non-refugee class intake be economic class, people with skills, and 40% be family class. Now that has an impact, Mr. Speaker, on how we operate, a big impact on how we operate the immigration system now, and it has huge implications for the type of bill proposed in this case that would expand, that would purport to expand the family class. Now, we have had a lot of complaints in this House going back many years about the so-called immigration backlog, the processing times. They take too long, says everyone. But if one looks closely at the immigration system, we will see, not to our surprise, that we have in virtually every year going back 25 years, every year we have succeeded in bringing into Canada numbers of people within our targets. Those targets are selected every year by the government and by the department. And every year we have successfully brought into Canada the exact number of people, give or take a few thousand, of persons that we projected we would bring in. And in order to bring in those people, we have to process them and get them into Canada and get them settled here. There's a whole process involved in that, and it's complex too. So even though we have a so-called backlog of approximately 800,000 people, we are succeeding every year as a country in bringing in exactly the same number of people that we want to bring in, and that is approximately 300,000. Now, if we have a backlog of 800,000 and we bring in about 300,000, that averages out to about about 3 years of inventory, let's just say, 2.5, 3 years of inventory of applications. So that is a given. So somebody who complains that there's a 3-year processing time for a particular immigrant is simply looking at the reality, because there is a 3-year, it takes us 3 years to move the 800,000 people through the system. There's no way to do it any quicker. The officials abroad can't process any more quickly than they do. And our immigration receiving areas, including Toronto, where I represent it riding proudly, and Vancouver and Montreal, other places where we receive large numbers of immigrants, are hardly capable of assimilating and settling numbers much larger than what's coming in now. These people have to have places to live and jobs and opportunities and schools. And so there are large numbers coming in now, approximately 1% of our population coming in every year. And this is a huge challenge for communities, and we invest federal money in that process. The point here is that the complaints about processing times in most cases are completely unfounded and don't take into account the fact that the department successfully achieves its targets every year. What the current bill would do is expand the definition of family class, but if we think about it, all this bill will do is expand that 40% family class component and push it out beyond where it is now. Because if we stick to the 40% rule, that family class the backlog, the number of applications will just get bigger. And suddenly we'll have a 6- and 7-year backlog, and it may impair our ability to prioritize the spousal component of family class. We have spouses who we do process within 6 to 12 months. And if we promise to do that, and the rest of the family class is still sitting there in a queue, and this current bill adds thousands and thousands of new family class applicants, not in the spousal category. That spousal queue, the family class queue is going to go out to 5 to 10 years. And I don't think members in the House would want to see that happen. So I know my time is quickly coming to the end. It's normal for immigration groups and settlement groups to want to support a bill like this, but we have to keep in mind that those groups, those people legitimately speak in favor of their clients, their members. They naturally have an interest in expanding the family immigration class. But we have to look at this bill in the overall picture. We've got to look at the overall immigration system. And at the present time, it is not simply doable, not achievable, to simply change the definition and hope that all the rest of the system will work well. And I regret that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise du débat. L'honorable député de...
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Laval. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am pleased to speak to this bill, sponsored by my colleague from Parkdale High Park. Mr. Speaker, I listened to what was said previously, and if it's true that we do have some concerns about who will be coming into Canada, I think we have to examine this bill from another perspective, because in my opinion, when we talk about people being able to sponsor someone once in their lifetime, we're talking about human beings. We're not talking about quotas. When we talk about someone being able to sponsor someone else once in their lives, we're talking about human beings. Human beings who come here with dreams. They come with nothing. Sometimes it takes them a few years to feel that they've put down roots, that they're integrated in society, that they're able to make a contribution, and now they want to bring someone else from their family, not an immediate member, but another member of their family, and help these people have a better future, a better life. I don't think there's anything more noble than that, Mr. Speaker. That is wanting to help someone who wishes to immigrate to Canada or Quebec. Even this is a remotely connected person, it's still it's very important to note that when someone leaves their country, they're seeking something better, something that will bring more to them, that will enable them to develop on all fronts. That is financially, physically, spiritually. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, that this must be taken into account before we think of anything else. And here I refer to this bill specifically. I'm saying this now because in my writing there are two individuals that I know very well, two people who are refugees, political refugees, and these people have a special problem today. These people would like to unite their family. They want their children to come over and join them, but unfortunately, it's very difficult to do so. We talk about a record in terms of immigration, or delays rather. Yes, there are delays. There are 115,000 applications in September. There were 115,000 requests. And this dates back to 2005. But we only have 50 or so positions. So how 50 commissioner positions. So how are these commissioners supposed to process more than applications than that are already doing? They're not robots. And Mr. Speaker, and this lack of positions occurred once the Conservatives got into power. 2 years ago, there were only 5 vacancies, and the person who was to replace them had a list of 80 people that could fill these positions quickly, efficiently. They could replace those 5 positions that were empty, but the Conservatives preferred to wait. And they continue to leave these positions vacant. And now, if there's a delay, it's not because we're welcoming too many immigrants. It's because positions have been cut. There are positions that have been cut in the immigration sector. So these two people in my writing are refugees, and they met each other in a refugee camp. The woman had children who she thought had died in her village when her village was attacked. She was saved in extremis, brought to a refugee camp, and then she came here. And a few years later, to her surprise, someone said that they saw her children alive. Since then, she's been trying to get these children back. She's been trying to find these children, and all kinds of obstacles are in her way. In the same couple, we have a man. He worked for the government at that time in Tanzania. When he realized that catastrophe was coming, he left his job. By leaving his job, he became an enemy of the military state, and there was an attempt to assassinate it. So he was put in a refugee camp, and when he found himself here in Canada as a political refugee, when he left the camp, he didn't say that he had children because he feared for their lives. One refugee thought her children were dead, and the other one feared for the lives of his children. So these two individuals are having problems getting their children here. They're even being refused. They're even trying to use DNA sampling, but they're told that this is too complicated. Can you just imagine, Mr. Speaker, when you're asking immigrants to sponsor someone once in their lives, and these people who belong in our wider family? Well, I heard my colleague earlier. He said immigrants have to find a job, a school, they have to get integrated, all that. But the best way to integrate, Mr. Speaker, is to arrive in a country where there are people you know, where there's at least some type of family network, where there are people who love you and who are going to support you as you get settled. That's the best way to arrive. You can count on people, and you don't find yourself all by yourself like many people have had to do when they first arrive. I don't think there's any better way to go about it. And to say that we're opening the door to potential dangers for the country. Dangers to the country? Well, these people have been accepted as permanent residents, as citizens. They've already been investigated. And these are the people who would like to sponsor individuals who in turn will be investigated. It's not because that the person's going to be sponsored that they don't have to, that they get an exemption from the investigation. All the refugees have to go through a screening process. So some members of the government are trying to make us believe that this is a very dangerous bill. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but we are concerned. We believe that this bill has merit and that it is certainly deserving of being sent to committee so that we can study it in a more in-depth basis, so we can establish the parameters. So if there's something that's bothering us, well, we can take action. That's what we want to do, Mr. Speaker. That's what committees are all about, Mr. Speaker. So I believe my Conservative colleague's not even going to listen to me. But for once, I think that they should hear reason and vote in favor of this bill in committee. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vancouver East.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, let me say I'm very delighted to rise in the House today to support Bill C-394 from the member from Parkdale High Park. This is a terrific bill. And I say that because all of us in the NDP have given very strong support to this idea that this is one simple thing that we can do to fix the terrible system that we have for immigration in this country. The idea of allowing families here in Canada to sponsor just once in a lifetime, one time only, a relative who wouldn't otherwise qualify under the existing family class. And I'm very pleased to say, Mr. Speaker, that originally I sponsored this bill, and I'm delighted now that that the member from Parkdale High Park has this bill, because I know that she's been a passionate advocate for family reunification, as have all of us here in the NDP. And I just want to remind the House, because they've probably forgotten, especially the Liberals, that this idea of once in a lifetime and be able to sponsor a family member actually came from a former Liberal citizenship and immigration minister. Now, we know that the Liberals like to turn their back on all of the things that they once believed in, and this is just another example of that. It was actually the minister, Eleanor Kaplan, who suggested this program. She came to Vancouver, talked about it publicly. It got a huge reception in the community, and people thought it was a great idea. She came back to Ottawa. The bureaucrats got hold of her, I think, and maybe other members of her caucus, and that was the end of that. And I thought, well, this is a good opportunity, and as a result of that, we developed this bill, and we haven't let go of it since. We believe that it's a very sound idea, and it's very interesting to hear the debate today, to hear the Conservative members saying, oh, well, you know, it's going to be unsustainable, it's going to be unmanageable, it's going to create a huge backlog. Isn't this the party that claimed that they would fix the immigration system? Isn't this the party that went out and campaigned on that, and yet still we have a system where people get completely clogged in the system? It takes years and years to get a family member here, to reunite with a loved one, to come here as an independent. I mean, they didn't do anything, as the Liberals did before them. So I found it kind of ironic that the folks who said that they were going to clean up the immigration system and allow people to come here are now denying this very straightforward, simple proposal that would actually allow families here at least some relief, some way of reuniting with a family member. And, Mr. Speaker, it strikes me as well very ironic that here in Canada, for example, we have the province of Manitoba, which has the most successful provincial nominee program in Canada. We have the Premier of Manitoba, who just came back from the Philippines with agreements and proposals to increase immigration from the Philippines. I know that Manitoba over the last year has seen something like 10,000 new immigrants come to that province alone with their family members. They're using their provincial nominee program because they're so fed up with the fact that the federal program just doesn't work anymore. So there's an indication of something that's actually working, and we should be giving credit certainly to the government of Manitoba for recognizing the importance of immigration in their community. And I know certainly in my own community of Vancouver East, we would not exist in Vancouver. We would have the history of immigration has built our city. The people who work in our city, the people who provide businesses, who provide service, a cultural contribution. Vancouver would not exist as a modern-day city if it were not for immigration. And I know that I, like all of my colleagues in the NDP, and I'm sure other members of the House, every day we have people coming to our office with the most heartfelt stories of not being able to be reunited with family members. We deal with hundreds of cases every year. And some of them you just want to cry when you see the stories that unfold of how people have to deal with this system and the heartbreak that they have to go through when all they're trying to do is to have a reunification of their family. And it seems to me that, you know, the studies and the evidence of what the net benefits are for Canada for immigration are huge. I don't think anybody here would dispute that. So the question remains, why today, when we have an opportunity to vote on this bill, would we have the Conservatives and the Liberals actually speaking against it? Why wouldn't we take this opportunity to do something straightforward and simple that won't affect the system overall, but will make a huge difference in the lives of tens of thousands of families in this country who would have the opportunity to bring forward a son or a daughter over age 22 who's not a dependent, or maybe an aunt or an uncle, or a brother or a sister or a first cousin, might be someone who's very close to them in terms of their family relations, but under existing provisions would be prohibited and prevented from doing so. So, Mr. Speaker, to me this bill has always been a complete win-win situation. It speaks to the deep values and the history that we have in this country of supporting and encouraging immigration and seeing the incredible positive benefits that come from it. We have an opportunity here to say we know the system overall isn't working, but at least let's do this one thing that would allow some people to come here and be reunited with their family. So, Mr. Speaker, it's very, very disappointing today to see the Conservative members just kind of dish this and say, well, that's not going to work. To hear the Liberal members say, well, we don't care about this anymore. We're not going to allow that to happen. Exactly. Where's the former Minister of Immigration? Maybe we should have her here in the House and she could speak for it. But I want to tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the members of the NDP, we're behind this bill 100%. We think it's workable. It is manageable. It is something that has incredible support in the community. We've had petitions coming in. We've had letters coming in. People want to see this happen. And this is a situation where we could do something small but would have a very big impact for people and their individual lives. So I hope that members, it is a private member's bill, so really people should be making up their own mind about this. They should be looking at the merits of this bill, never mind what the parliamentary secretary said, looking at this bill and thinking about your constituents and whether or not your constituents support a measure like this. And I think if members address this bill on that basis, they will find that they have to support that bill. And again, I congratulate the member for Parkdale High Park for bringing it forward. We're sticking with it. And we will stick with this bill, and we'll do everything we can to get it through. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, reprise du débat. I am now recognizing the honourable member for Parkdale High Park for her right of reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to thank my colleagues for their input in this debate, especially my colleague from Vancouver East, who has been a trailblazer when it comes to immigration policy. I would like to thank my colleagues in the bloc who have spoken in support, and colleagues in the Liberal and Conservative parties have expressed opposition to this bill, and I guess I'm a little baffled by that. Of course, there's no one perfect solution to an immigration system, but as we look around the world and we see insecurity and hardship, we appreciate what we've built here in Canada. We know that there are others wanting to come to Canada. We know there are many newcomers who come here as refugees that are separated against their will. But we know that one of the best predictors of newcomers' success in settlement is the support of family members, and that's why family reunification is so important. The enormous advantage newcomers have when they can count on the economic, social, and psychological support of family members is readily apparent. We need to assist families to reunite as quickly as possible. The sponsorship requirements on families are enormous. To take responsibility for another person for 10 years is a huge commitment and responsibility. 10 years is a long time. Things can change, but the sponsor is still on the hook, which is quite a significant responsibility. People don't take sponsorship lightly, as some in the Conservative and Liberal parties suggest. There's not going to be an opening of the floodgates here because of the very onerous requirements of the sponsorship responsibilities. Members of the government expressed concern that the bill would open the floodgates and increase the backlog, but clearly the unacceptable delays in the immigration system today are caused by inadequate resources. Families didn't create this backlog. It's clearly the factor of a lack of resources by this government and the previous government. Certainly there would be some additional applicants under this bill, which is why I'm proposing it. But, Mr. Speaker, let's look at the facts. As Canada positions itself early on in the 21st century, we face some steep challenges. We have an aging population. There's a demographic shift in the workplace as baby boomers retire, which is a greater burden on our social programs, especially Medicare. New growth in Canada's future workforce will come from immigration. We'll be competing with countries around the world for the best and brightest newcomers. And one factor newcomers look at is the ability to be joined by their family members, their closest relatives in the new country of their choice. Others come to Canada as a safe haven. They come as refugees, and they're desperate to have their family members join them here. Why would we place additional barriers in front of newcomers? And there are other options. I sit on the industry committee, and I hear corporate executives come to the industry committee calling for a rapid expansion of the temporary workers program. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't think that's the way to go. People who come here temporarily, they often are unskilled, they're paid very low wages, they may not speak either official language, and they're extremely vulnerable to exploitation. We've seen this already with some high-profile problems across our country. The better way to address a labour shortage is to increase the acceptance of working-age adults as immigrants so that they start off when they come to Canada with full rights and full participation to all aspects of Canadian society, and my family reunification bill would do just that. Let's also recognize that Canada falls far behind many other countries in looking after some of our most vulnerable members. Family members, when they come and reunite with newcomer families, they can provide child care, elder care, and care for people with disabilities, and that's how they help family members settle. They'll save Canada resources in doing so. We'll have the opportunity to demonstrate whether or not we support the idea of family reunification. We don't have to agree on all the details, but if we support the goal, let's vote in favour of this bill, take it to committee, and there we can answer questions and make any amendments that need to be made. I thank my honourable colleagues. I thank you for your support on this important initiative, and for those of you who have spoken against, I urge you reconsider, support newcomers, and support this bill for family reunification.
Is the House ready for the question? La question est la suivante.
The question is as follows.
By Ms. Washley-Solis, move that Bill C-394, an act to amend the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, sponsorship and relative, be now read a second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. Plaît-il à la Chambre d'adopter?
Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion?
All those in favour of the motion will please say yea. Que tous ceux qui s'y opposent.
All of those against the motion will please say nay.
In my opinion, the nays have it. Pursuant to Standing Order 93, the division stands deferred until Wednesday, March 5th, 2008, immediately before the time provided for private members' business. Comme il est 13h56.
It being 1:55, the House will adjourn until next Monday at 11 a.m. pursuant to Standing Order 24.1.